The apostles are those who stand at the top of the world, collectively known as the 12 super beings. The story says that each of the apostles, dressed in a blue cloak with a deep hood, was incredibly strong. Some could control water comparable in volume to the oceans, others opposed entire human empires. Moreover, they could create new worlds from their flesh and blood, cradling them in their arms like babies. Among them is the most powerful apostle named Yolman, who has limitless power. According to records, his combat power is far superior to other apostles, but its origin is unknown. The highest category of danger is designated as an apostle, but when the apostles themselves disappeared, they gradually began to be forgotten, remembered only in legends. The dark-haired guy, dressed in a formal suit and cape, sneezed loudly. Scratching his nose, he looked back at the icy mountains with snow caps surrounding him, and thought displeasedly that soldiers would quickly come into this cold and fight this small dragon. Ice Dragon Warcraft. Category Disaster. The most dangerous category in the existing Warcraft classification, has great destructive power. The brunette watched as the Ice Dragon led various monsters of the north into the Thunderfield. To protect national security, the Guam Empire immediately deployed its troops to defend it. This battle will begin soon. The human warriors talked among themselves. Some asked whether their temporary detachment could win. Others answered that only God knew the answer to this question. Finally, the cry of a warrior on the front line was heard, which started the battle. Armored people, waving swords in one hand and holding shields in the other, roared towards the army of monsters led by the Ice Dragon. Huge giants brought down the power of their fists on them. Raising his head and opening his mouth in surprise, the knight watched as birds of prey rushed at him from above with a deafening roar. The human army, like toy figures, flew away from the blows of the enemies. The dragon, sparkling with its red eyes, crushed knights right and left with its sharp wings. The guy stood on a high slope and, seeing the squad running away in horror, muttered that these soldiers were not opponents of monsters. Thoughtfully putting his finger to his lips, he thought that the disparity in combat power was too great. Most likely, the people would soon lose. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a red-haired stranger appeared in the battle arena, urging them not to panic. The brunette looked back in surprise when he heard a girl's voice in the icy mountains. She continued her speech by saying that just because the enemy is stronger does not mean that they are losing. Standing on the edge of the ice floe, she released a stream of fire directly from her palm upward. If she retreats now, then everything will definitely end in failure. Lowering her hand, the girl directed the fire directly towards the Ice Dragon. This frail-looking stranger was named Sierra Charlotte, one of the 4 great mages of the Guam Empire, known as the Fire Witch, was appointed to lead this army. The people perked up, exclaiming joyfully that now, thanks to Miss Sierra, they had a chance to win. Pointing her hand towards the monsters, Charlotte loudly gave the order to attack. With their fighting spirit high, the knights rushed to the offensive with renewed vigor. A snowstorm, immediately after the fiery stream, covered the dragon headlong with a huge shaft, and when the snow subsided, the predator's eyes narrowed dangerously. The dragon, flapping its wings, roared and rose up. People turned around in shock, and Sierra, who attacked him with a fiery explosion magic attack, could not believe that he was still moving. The animal released a large ice ball from its mouth, so that in the next second they would spew ice and snow onto the human army, which buried the warriors alive within themselves, killing them on the spot. The dragon flapped its wings, and the ice figures broke into several pieces right in the air. The Fire Witch, gritting her teeth, powerlessly watched the death of her army. Unable to bear it, she ran and jumped down, right into the thick of things. Raising a fiery sword above her, Sierra shouted that she, being a magician of the Guam Empire, would not allow the dragon to win. The monster turned toward the sound, its eyes flashing with rage. The girl's sword landed with a clang on the dragon's icy tail. Their gazes, full of rage, rested on each other. Each one, calling on magic, attacked the enemy with his weapon, but they were unable to touch each other. Charlotte jumped up, fleeing the ice attack. The girl landed confidently on the cold ground. She formed a circle of fire around herself, from which burning arrows separated, ready to fly at the ice monster at any second. He, without wasting time, released another frosty, deadly portion of a snowstorm from his insides. The witch rushed forward with a furious cry, followed by faithful arrows. The dragon, opening its fanged mouth, spewed out a magical ice ball. All that remained was to watch how the ice and fire rushed towards each other. Two elements collided in battle with a deafening sound, but the dragon's power turned out to be many times stronger, and the icy stream broke the circle of fire. With a squeak, Sierra realized she was trapped. The ice extinguished the flame in a matter of seconds and crushed the witch into an ice block. Charlotte fell into the snow with a thud. Wounded, she, clearing her throat, tried to roll over onto her stomach, but her body did not obey the girl. The knights watched the leader in shock. No one dared to come closer. One of the warriors began to cry in despair, asking what to do now, even if Lady Sierra lost. Someone's sword landed on the ground with a clang. The knight backed away, sobbing that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He turned sharply and rushed out of the battlefield. They could not win. The others looked after him with their mouths open. Realizing that there was no point in resisting, the entire company ran away after their brother. Charlotte, still lying on the cold ground, held out her hands, trying to stop her fallen army. When she was able to sit down, she found herself completely alone in the icy desert. The girl's shoulders trembled with anger. Somehow, throwing off fiery sparks from herself, the witch managed to get to her feet. With just her lips she hissed words of hatred in the wake of the cowardly knights. Suddenly, behind her, she heard someone asking her why the witch didn't run away. Because there was no chance of winning at all. Charlotte turned around sharply. Who dared say such a thing? A guy stood in front of her, holding his hands in his trouser pockets, and smiling smugly, introduced himself as a man who wanted to earn a few gold coins here. Leaning forward a little, he repeated the question without ceasing to smile. Sierra shook her head, answering that the word runaway had never been in her vocabulary, and never would be. The stranger chuckled, putting his hand over his mouth, saying that while it was cute, they didn't have time to talk about it right now. The witch was not going to stop the argument, and defiantly asked what he was talking about, not seeing what was happening behind her back. Finally, she realized that she was distracted and turned around at the sound of flapping wings. At the same moment the dragon, opening his mouth, he attacked his opponents with ice magic. Sierra had no choice but to helplessly cover her face with her hands. Now it's all over. But for some reason, after a few seconds she realized that she was still alive and opened her eyes. Incredibly, the stranger literally held the monster with one hand, while the other still remained in his pocket. The guy loudly exclaimed that the dragon was bothering him. A shadow ran across his face, saying that he was talking to the miss, the brunette, with a casual movement threw the ice creature away from him. Because a small creature like this dragon should calm down. Having fallen on his back, the enemy, still rolling on the ground, comically kicked his paws in the air. He couldn't understand what happened a minute ago. Towing, he regained his balance and rolled over, digging into the ground with his claws. The dragon seemed to have doubled in size after the absurd defeat, bristled and now looked down at its tiny enemy. The stranger extended his hand, gathering his magic together. Smirking, he said that he seemed to have met a naughty dragon, while purple magical runes formed on his palm. The red eyes sparkled dangerously. Unfortunately for the dragon, he would soon be burned. It looked like the monster had never encountered anything like this before, and looked at the guy in bewilderment. Sierra couldn't believe her eyes. The purple whirlwind emanating from the palm of the puny stranger was spinning the dragon like a rag doll. Finally, a raging magical hurricane hid the huge figure of the enemy from view. When the purple haze cleared, a beautiful blue crystal remained in the air. It landed right in the brunette's palm. He threw a stone into the air, turned around and asked the witch if she would go on a date with him at the expense of her life saved. The girl, kneeling down, pressed her left hand over the wound on the forearm of her right hand. This impudent man was able to kill a disaster category monster with one movement. She felt something ringing in her head and her eyes closed. Having only had time to ask who he was, Charlotte leaned back unconscious. She was immediately picked up by a sudden savior. Bending over the girl, he said with a smile that he was a simple mercenary who decided to earn some gold coins. Yolman was the first among the apostles, nicknamed Limitless. Everything that was happening flashed before my eyes as if through a veil, a purple whirlwind in which the ice dragon met its death. The stranger looked over his shoulder with a caustic grin as he tossed the crystal into his palm. Sierra's eyes widened in horror. Abruptly sitting up in bed, she screamed and reached out with her hand for the ice dragon. She must catch it and kill it. But suddenly realization overwhelmed the girl. Her hands felt not the snow cover, but soft blankets. Where did she end up? The voice of the chief magician of the Empire of Guam Aces, the gray-haired director of the Royal Academy, was heard, He looked up from the book he was reading and asked the witch how she was feeling, because she had been sleeping for several days. Sierra, clutching the blanket, asked the director with a desperate cry what happened to the ice dragon. The old man slammed the book shut, answering that the dragon had been destroyed, and Charlotte herself needed to lie down, rest, and not worry about anything. The lenses of his glasses sparkled as the man looked closely at Sierra and asked what happened in the end and how the monster died. Biting her lip, Charlotte frantically tried to remember at least something, but she couldn't do it. Aces chuckled under his breath. That's how it is. He brought a thing to the girl that looked like a small finger-sized lamp with a purple light burning in it, and asked her to take a closer look. Charlotte stared at the flame in shock. The magician said that when he arrived on the battlefield, the fire was next to the witch. Even when Sierra did not come to her senses, it did not disappear. Hellfire is a flame that people will never be able to manipulate unless it is. The witch clenched her teeth angrily and finished the director's speech. If it's not an apostle. The man, fingering the strands of his long beard, said that the apostles had been missing for a long time, but since Hellfire appeared in this battle, it means they clearly don't know something. The Aces placed the book on the table before leaving the room. Finally, he told the silently sitting witch that she had done a good job and she should rest, so he left so as not to disturb her. The old man, without turning around, said that in addition, the Empire would claim that it was Charlotte's squad that defeated the ice dragon. Then he finally turned around and smiled, consoling the downcast Sierra. In the end, anything related to the apostles will cause a lot of unnecessary panic, so the girl should just accept all the honors and praise. She, squeezing the blanket with all her strength, whispered to the now empty room that she would do this. The people, gathered at the walls of the academy, enthusiastically greeted Sierra and thanked her for her victory. Meanwhile, in the city tavern, one of the military detachments gathered to have a feast. Yolman sat in the corner of the bar, holding his forehead with his palm. He was worried that there would be an uproar when his identity was revealed. But then it dawned on the guy, he would never see cute girls who would treat him like a hero, because the apostle came to the human world to find himself a girl. Throwing a bag of things over his shoulder, he got ready to leave, and thought that he needed to leave this city and hide somewhere. Meanwhile, a detachment of Imperial soldiers was heading towards the doors of the tavern. Tears appeared in the brunette's eyes as he said goodbye to his favorite tavern and the beautiful lady behind the bar. The knights approached the door of the bar, and the leading warrior, a blond man in a red cloak, loudly asked those present which of them was a mercenary. Everyone in the tavern, looking around, simultaneously pointed their fingers at Yolman, who was trying to hide. The guy froze. Has he really been discovered? The commander-in-chief loudly reported that Yolman was now invited to take part in the entrance test to the Royal Academy. The warriors buzzed with displeasure. This is the best academy in the Guam Empire, and this guy only recently came here. Why was he invited? In response to the outrage, the man asked a counter-question. Did everyone present here participate in the battle against the ice dragon along with this man? The faces of the warriors stretched out. Is this really about the recent battle against the ice dragon? Someone said in the ensuing silence that only a handful of people survived there, and this guy was one of them. The man in the red cloak pointed at Yolman. Besides all this, the guy turned out to be safe and sound in the battle. He asked if the soldiers had any questions. They fell silent again. Yolman raised his hand sharply. Clenching his fist, he exhaled and asked if there were many beautiful girls in this academy. The commander-in-chief was confused. He clearly did not expect such a question. Meanwhile, young beauties in short school uniforms that did not hide their thighs and high stockings actually studied at the academy. The elastic chest rose in time with the girls' breathing. Yes, the Royal Academy of the Guam Empire could boast of its hand-picked students. Yolman was in Rio Paradise. Aces stood on the balcony with the commander-in-chief, who asked the director why he decided to train an incompetent mercenary. The old man, squinting his eyes good-naturedly, replied that young people should be given the opportunity to prove themselves. The magician watched the young man spin like a spinning top, looking at the pretty girls, and continued that these people may have unexpected talents. Yolman did not notice anything around, looking around the short skirts with a loving gaze. Ace's voice rang out loudly in the hall. He congratulated those in the building for getting a chance to enter the Royal Academy, and in order to understand whether they were suitable for the academy, the entrance test would begin right now. The man added that he hoped that the candidates would do everything in their power to pass and survive, at which time various pentagrams painted in red began to appear on the floor. Those present began to talk worriedly. What did he mean? How to survive? Suddenly, huge clawed paws began to appear from the magic circles. Furious clattering could be heard from everywhere, and fiery demonic wolves appeared from the runes, summoning beasts that only experienced fire mages could summon. Trembling with fear, the candidates asked each other if this training would kill them. At the end of the hall, having acquired the habit of calling all the pretty girls sisters, Yolman assured one of them that he would protect her and that there was no reason to worry. The crowd scattered as a pack of fiery wolves rushed at them. Some still did not do anything, not believing that this was a real monster. The apostle, putting his hands in his pockets, chuckled boredly. Is it really worth making such a fuss over such a small fish? One of the candidates tried to throw off panic and began to cast magic. He encouraged the others to work together to show what they were capable of, creating runes in the air with confident movements. Many dark vines began to burst out from his palms, but they turned out to be nothing to the wolves. They easily jumped up, playfully, avoiding the trap. Someone from the crowd released their currents at the enemies, but the fire wolves dealt with this even faster than with the vines. One of the magicians widened his eyes. He never expected such an outcome of events. What no one could have imagined was that one of the wolves would run up to a nearby guy and tear off his head with one jerk, licking his bloody mouth. The pink-haired witch shook in horror when this happened very close to her. Future students scattered when it became clear that this was not an imitation. The fire wolves really decided to kill everyone. Desperate cries were heard calling for escape. Yolman still didn't seem to understand what was happening and awkwardly stomped around the wall. Suddenly someone loudly called the fleeing people fools. A tall, long-haired blonde in uniform, who had been silent until then, created a shield between himself and the wolves, shouting that in such a situation, a mass exodus is really a stupid decision, as how people become the target of enemies. With a wave of his hands, he created magical air targets. They tightly enveloped the unsuspecting animals. Then the stranger ordered the fleeing candidates to attack the wolves. This worked. The future students divided into their battle groups. The archers attacked with arrows from the left flank. Mages should attack from the right flank. The swordsmen are right in the center. A huge amount of magic and fighting forces attacked the entire flock at the same time. A moment later, the immobilized monsters lay whining in different corners of the hall. The overjoyed candidates saluted each other and high-fived. They did it. Loud cries of joy were heard from everywhere that they really managed to win. But unfortunately, this was not the case. Red fiery figures were approaching the crowd. This wasn't the end, oh no. The flock suddenly merged together in a huge bloody and fiery dance. The future students raised their heads, watching in horror what was happening. He appeared from the flames, the fiery wolf Cerberus, several heads protruding from one body, ready to tear apart anyone who approached. Mages and warriors pointed swords and wands at the monster. Cerberus watched them, spewed flame, and was itself made of it. Inspired candidates were ready to jump into action. The blonde noticed that this was really a royal academy, since they used such a dangerous monster for a test. The monster, growling, released fireballs straight from its body into the crowd. The candidates frantically thought about how to protect themselves from the flying fire, but the force of the attack was so great that it instantly knocked the warriors off their feet. Yolman, who was watching this, who had not moved from his place from the very beginning of the battle, felt that one of the clumps was flying at him. Without even taking his hands out of his pockets, he shrugged. Such a weak attack, it's not even worth paying attention to. But the rest made so much noise because of this. Suddenly he saw a shadow above him, of someone else's female breast. Yolman raised his head, blushing deeply. The stranger ran straight at him, pushing him away from the burning attack. Still red as a lobster, the guy looked reverently at the stranger lying on him. White hair tied with a bow and huge eyes of a girl who examined the rescued one. She got up on her knees, telling him to be careful, because he was almost hit. The girl hovered over him and asked if everything was okay. Yolman could only open and close his mouth. There was another explosion, showering the couple with shards of glass and walls. The girl, rising to her feet, moved away from Yolman, but turned around and wished him to be more careful next time. The discouraged guy sat on the step and watched as the fragile stranger came closer to Cerberus, saying that the rest should be left to her. The apostle blushed again. She was really worried about him. Thoughts about the battle faded into the background for him. Pressing his palms to his face, he realized that some feeling made his heart beat faster. Meanwhile, the blonde girl swung her hand and created an ice boomerang. and the next moment she threw him at the monster. Ice boomerangs attacked the demonic dog from all sides. Crouching, the stranger created a large magic circle. Lianas began to creep towards Cerberus, enveloping their powerful paws. The rest of the warriors stood up menacingly. Their help should not be forgotten either. The girl asked to distract Cerberus for a while so that she could use a restraining spell. The crowd moved towards the dog from different angles, attacking with swords, arrows, and magic. The angry Cerberus rushed with all his heads at his opponents, throwing them to the sides. Meanwhile, the witch jumped into the vacated space to create a powerful attack spell from there. The magic circle hung directly above Cerberus's head. The dog raised his head and spewed streams of fire in that direction. The girl stretched out her hands and created ice shackles. First, ice crystals stretched under Cerberus, shackling the dog's paws. Then, from above, from the magic circle, collars fell out for each of the monster's heads. Cerberus found himself trapped in ice with ice collars on his necks and paws shackled by ice flows. The surprised candidates opened their mouths. Did she really succeed? Yolman smiled dreamily. The test should be completed soon, and he himself would definitely talk to this young lady later. Sierra, standing in the distance, grinned. No, this is not the end. Suddenly, a powerful stream of fire flew right next to the blonde witch's face. She turned around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Right behind her, Cerberus was burning all the created ice magic with hellish fire. Clattering the teeth of its 3 mouths, it chewed through the collars and trampled the ice under its paws. The girl jumped to the side. What kind of flame is this? The blonde who had attacked Cerberus earlier shouted that some fool had used fire magic. His hair flew up as the guy created a powerful wind barrier that blocked the flames. The crowd buzzed. Could he really cope with the fire? What amazing wind magic. Currents of air picked up the dog and lifted him up. Yolman said to himself that the wind cannot extinguish the flame, but it can restrain it. Has this man really calculated such subtleties? Despite this, after a few seconds Cerberus was free and ran towards the blonde witch. The girl cowered in fear as a huge shadow approached her. Nascent magic flashed in her palm and immediately went out. It had not yet recovered. Yolman came to the fore. This was his chance to show himself. He suddenly appeared right in front of the witch. Grinning victoriously in advance, she screamed in surprise. Grabbing the stranger by the shoulder, he pulled her towards him. Turning away from Cerberus, Yolman pressed the witch, whispering that her dear little sister should not be afraid. The apostle's red eyes sparkled with anticipation. He pathetically said that this wild dog just needed to be kicked so that it would finally shut up, and put his left hand forward, squeezing the girl in his right. From powerful magic, Cerberus flew sharply into the opposite wall and landed on it with a roar, destroying the surface. Yolman chuckled. This is how he should charm his sister. Lowering his head, he saw how her face turned red and her eyes filled with tears. Without letting go of the witch, he worriedly asked if he had hurt her while he was kicking this dog. She, without moving, tearfully asked to finally let her go. And only then Yolman realized what kind of softness and elasticity he had felt in his hand for a long time. The blonde witch pressed her fists into his chest and turned her head away, asking him not to touch her. The apostle, blushing, quickly walked away and put his hands forward, apologizing and assuring that he did not do it on purpose. Both, blushing, stood at a distance from each other. The other guys, watching this scene, were indignant. How did this bastard dare to use such a moment to touch the goddess? And when did he even manage to approach her? A clear female voice was heard. At this stage, their test was completed. The crowd parted and a beautiful, stately woman appeared in front of those present. She stood at the destroyed steps, her hands folded on her chest. One of the candidates, covered in scratches and with charred clothes here and there, asked in surprise who she was. The stranger sternly introduced herself. Sarah, deputy director. The blonde, who attacked Cerberus with his strong magic, reproachfully asked the woman what the hell happened here. But she was surprised by the question. Then the guy pointed his finger at the lifeless body of one of the students. Is it really possible that an ordinary test for the Royal Academy can simply kill people? Sarah narrowed her eyes and smiled mysteriously. Before the blonde had time to blink an eye, the deputy director seemed to be drawing out with magic all the destruction, human and those that touched the building itself. Moreover, from the way the supposedly dead students gradually disappeared, it became clear that this was just an illusion. Tossing her long hair, the woman held translucent cards in her hands and laughed. What did they say about the students? The blonde stared at Sarah in bewilderment. Is this really the magic of puppets? The warriors were talking among themselves that there were rumors about the deputy director of the Royal Academy, who could control objects using magic. Sarah stepped forward and said that now that everything was settled, she wanted to say a few words. First of all, the vice principal wanted to congratulate the remaining people for passing the test and being accepted into the Royal Academy of Guam Ace class. Yolman's ears perked up as a couple of pretty students began to discuss the fact that Ace's class was taught by a great wizard, and who would be doing it this year. The guy's eyes lit up. What if she turned out to be his cute little sister? Sarah caught everyone's attention again. She was announcing the teacher of Ace's class. A shock of red hair flashed before Yolman's eyes. He took a step back in surprise. The vice principal introduced Sierra Charlotte, the new class leader and the person in charge of the students. She looked sternly at those present with her blue eyes. The blonde which opened her mouth in admiration, the fire which herself will teach them. Sarah said that everyone seemed to have heard about Sierra's teacher's reputation. But if you had any more questions, you could ask her directly. Sierra said goodbye to the deputy, who, saying that she needed to return to her duties, left the room. The crowd clung to the girl with enthusiasm, bombarding her with questions about what they would do now. At this time, Yolman tried in every possible way not to catch her eye. With her hands folded across her chest, Sierra was extremely serious. She explained that the students were free for today, and tomorrow, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they needed to gather at the training ground to practice fighting. After a moment of silence, she added that she hoped that the warriors would get along with each other, and if there were no more questions, those present could disperse. But the long-haired magician was not going to let her go so easily. He called out to Charlotte. She turned around, unhappy that she was distracted. He shouted that if they got into the ace class because of her strength, then why did that guy also pass? Naturally, he could not help but notice Yolman sneaking from the center of the hall, and in his speech he singled him out from the crowd. The apostle forced a smile. Calm down, you need to control yourself. Sierra looked at the guy in bewilderment, and asked what was wrong with him. Yolman was immediately buried under a heap of accusations. The crowd said that he had done nothing, that he was lustful like a wolf, that he pestered students every now and then, and that he was simply terrible. A blonde which immediately stood up for him. She said that it was a lie, that he was with her to help, and the rest was just an accident. Some student gasped, "What a kind goddess." Sierra quickly walked towards the apostle. At first he was internally horrified, but he thought that time he erased her memory, which means the girls shouldn't recognize him. The red-haired witch took a closer look, thoughtfully saying that the guy's face seemed familiar to her, and they could have met somewhere, but he waved his hands, saying that this was impossible, and she confused him with someone. Charlotte clearly didn't trust him and asked her question again. Yolman waved it off again. He would probably remember such a sweet girl. He definitely wouldn't forget. The guys from the crowd began to talk indignantly about how this guy dared to hit on the fiery witch herself. The teacher should not allow such a person to enter Ace's class. The girl raised her hand, beckoning them to remain calm. She would only place the guy in Ace's class temporarily. She said that the girl he saved explained that the student did not do anything wrong. In addition, he was the only one who dared to help her, and oppose Cerberus. This courage is not like that of an ordinary person. Yolman broke into a reverent smile and thanked Teacher Sierra for such a compliment. Charlotte challenged the crowd. If any of them are dissatisfied with her decision, let them try to convince her. The silence in the hall meant only one thing: there were no people willing to do this. The blonde magician clenched his teeth angrily. Finally, this long day ended and night came. Aces received Sierra and Sarah in his office. He, clasping his hands in front of him, asked if all those who fought in the battle against the Ice Dragon were included in Ace's class. Charlotte replied that it was true. She leaned forward worriedly and asked if it was possible that the apostle would also be among these disciples. The director sat back in his chair and asked how the entrance test went. Sarah revealed that there was a student in the test who could hold his own against Cerberus. She furrowed her brows and continued to say that they didn't see the moment when he was right in front of the dog, because the next second Cerberus flew so far away, as if his body was out of control. The old man thought for a moment and answered, if the monster flew away, then perhaps the student used the magic of talent spells that ordinary magicians cannot use, only a few, and very capable ones. Talent magic is the rarest type of magic. Sierra convinced herself that maybe this was true. Aces looked at the large grandfather clock opposite, and advised the girls not to think too much about the apostle, since it was already quite late, and sent them to rest. The witches bowed and prepared to leave, wishing the director good night and a good rest. A few seconds later the door slammed behind them. The old man muttered something into his beard. He reached into his desk drawer and took hold of the beautifully carved handle. In the box there was a lamp with a violet hellish flame blazing in it. Taking the jar in his hand, the director stared at the light, and his loud sigh echoed throughout the office. Yolman, dressed in an academy uniform, wandered sadly around the yard, complaining about having to get up so early. He yawned sweetly. He really wanted to sleep, but the dream immediately disappeared as soon as he noticed the blonde top of the head of the witch he had saved. Sparks danced in the eyes. This is yesterday's little sister. It's time to talk to the stranger. He ran towards her, shouting greetings as he went. He suddenly blushed deeply as he ran closer. The witch's chest swayed as soon as she turned around. The guy almost fainted from this sight. He was in heaven. The girl, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, asked in a gentle voice what he wanted. Yolman's cheeks turned red. He awkwardly recalled yesterday's incident on the test. The witch also blushed deeply. She denied it, and assured him that everyone had misunderstood everything, and it was she who should thank her savior. The student giggled and asked his name. Introducing herself, her name was Aisha. Yolman feverishly began to think about how not to pronounce his real name. He replied that his name was Lu, only his first name, no last name. Aisha noted that this name suits him. The apostle awkwardly scratched the back of his head, and offered to go to class together. A long-haired blonde man watched them from afar. He growled quietly, still dissatisfied with the presence of the impudent guy. Finally, the students gathered in the large hall. Sierra, standing in front of them, suggested starting the lesson. She, with her hands on her hips, conjured magic runes on the floor and announced that today the students would fight against each other, and their opponent would be. But Charlotte was unable to finish her sentence, because a huge fiery tiger jumped out onto the crowd right from the circle. The student, clearly one of the smartest in the class, noted that the young tiger, although an ordinary fire-type summon beast, had great fire power. The long-haired magician mockingly said that they would be dealing with one young tiger. Is this really fair to the tiger itself? Charlotte immediately retorted, she did not say that there would be one animal. A lottery will be held, according to which students will be divided into pairs. 2 people with the same number will form a group. While she was saying that within an hour they would have to defeat the tiger, more and more huge saber-toothed cats appeared behind her. Yolman unfolded the sheet. There was number 7. Aisha got the first number. The guy whined that fate was not at all favorable to him. Meanwhile, someone approached the witch. She turned around at the sound of footsteps. The long-haired magician bowed respectfully to her and introduced himself, saying that he was very lucky to be able to team up with such a beautiful miss. His name was Kyle, and the guy was the eldest son of the Smith family. But it seemed that the witch was not at all impressed by Kyle's attempts to charm her, and worriedly suggested that they first discuss battle strategy, because they had little time left. The magician waved his hand at those present and confidently replied that, compared to the others, he believed that to defeat the young tiger, one person would be enough for them, so let the girl let him figure it out. Aisha wanted to say something, but didn't have time. Kyle was already walking towards the tigers, leaving a final comment that it wouldn't take much time. He thought with a cheeky smile that with the strength of his family, he would deal with the tiger, and then this girl would take care of him. The magician stopped a few meters from the fiery tiger. He put his hand forward, casting a spell, saying that the animal looked very cute. The wind blade spell swept through the hall like a whirlwind towards the monster. Sierra, who was watching this, thought that Kyle's talent magic is a broken limiter. It can increase the outgoing magic attack by 1 level. Now, along with the increase effect, his attack level has increased to intermediate, or even to advance the magic of talent. Jan made a furrow in the stone floor with his claws, flying a couple of meters away. The wildcat's yellow eyes narrowed in rage. He roared and released a portion of a fiery flash from his mouth. Clenching his palms, Kyle called him a pathetic insect and created another spell. He threw a new stream of air directly at the tiger. The same one again sprinkled everything with fire. A wave of fire swept right near the crowd. The wind lifted the students' skirts, and they began to cover them with their hands, squealing. The guys coughed from the dust and fiery flashes. Kyle smiled smugly, saying that as he said, he managed to quickly deal with the monster. He slowly walked towards Aisha, saying how simple the training was, but she looked behind him in horror. the girl screamed, warning the magician of the danger. Kyle looked around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, a completely alive and even more angry tiger, Yang, attacked him. The magician looked blankly at the approaching monster. The guy continued to awkwardly stagnate. It seems that he woke up only when he saw the monster flying towards him with outstretched paws. Tiger Yang knocked him to the ground. Hovering over Kyle, the animal released a deadly stream of fire from its mouth. A student from the crowd turned to Sierra with concern. The tiger would destroy the magician on the spot. But she didn't even react, but continued frowning to look at the battle. The entire hall was filled with a raging fire, and for a moment the silhouettes of the fighters disappeared from sight. Suddenly the tiger jumped back in shock, and then he flew back, thrown away by the airflow. Kyle, whose only clothes were damaged, stood with a victorious smile, his hands in his pockets. He was not going to die here. The guy approached Aisha, asking her opinion, because their team should be the first to complete this task. Charlotte approached the couple and called out to them. She congratulated the winners and allowed them to rest, since they were the second to complete this task. Kyle was incredibly surprised, as was the witch behind him. He immediately shouted that it was impossible, no one could do it faster than him, and that there was some kind of mistake. The teacher pointed somewhere to the side. That's where the team that completed it first was located. They had already completed the task, and were one step ahead of Aisha and Kyle. The latter kept repeating that this was impossible. When the enthusiastic crowd parted, they saw an incredible sight. The fire tiger, like a domestic cat, lay on his back, tossing and turning funny, and Lou and his partner stroked his belly and called him cutie. This is what happened 15 minutes ago. Still frustrated, Yolman bemoaned the inability to be paired with Aisha. Suddenly someone approached him, calling out to him. He turned around, asking who was speaking to him. A militant-looking student stood in front of him, holding an axe in her hands as if it weighed nothing, and boldly said that now they were in the same group, and the guy could call her Arya. But Yolman did not pay attention to her, but continued to sigh languidly for Aisha. This made the girl quite angry, and the rest of the students were now laughing at the couple. Hissing offendedly, Arya swung her weapon with all her might and charged straight at Lou to get his attention. But he didn't seem to notice anything around him. Finally, he sighed heavily. Then he stopped the axe flying at him with 2 fingers. Still looking at the piece of paper, the apostle assured that he had heard everything. Arya's face darkened. This guy. She, easily throwing the weapon on her back, mockingly said that she had heard that Lou was a pervert, causing him to cry out indignation. Turning around, the girl finally said that she alone could cope with the young tiger, and that her partner should not cause problems. He thoughtfully watched as Arya, armed with a weapon, walked towards the tiger. Could she really handle it alone? The student screamed and jumped straight at the animal. Then she lowered the axe with a crash, but not entirely successfully. Tiger Yang jumped aside. He roared, his fanged mouth opening. A shadow fell on the girl's face. Her eyebrows met on the bridge of her nose. She shifted her weight to her right leg, holding the base of the axe firmly in her hands. Then she sharply lunged with her foot right at the tiger's face. But with this Arya drove herself into a trap. A fiery vine closed on her ankle, the tail of a tiger. After a few seconds, the animal threw the student far back with its tail. Her axe, like a boomerang, spun in the air several times, and a little later she landed with a roar, hitting the marble floor, making a hole there. Regrouping, Arya found herself on her knees, the weapon falling right next to her. The next moment the tiger accelerated and pounced from a height directly at the girl. The student, weakened, clenched her teeth from powerlessness. She grabbed the base of the axe tightly and pointed it at the tiger. The animal bit into the wooden base with its teeth. His teeth were dangerously close to Arya's hand. The girl closed her eyes tightly, surrendering to chance. If only she were at least a little stronger. At that moment, when the tiger Yan had already begun to fall on the student, Yolman's voice was heard, turning to the wild cat, asking why she was cruel to his little sister. The guy's eyes sparkled dangerously. As if he was out of his mind, he muttered something about a little kitten. Suddenly the tiger loosened its grip, and even somehow, was taken aback. As usual, Yolman, with his hands in his pockets, rocked on his toes, and said that the matter with the tiger had been decided. Arya, opening one eye, stared at him in bewilderment, and then she discovered that opposite her was no longer a ferocious fire-breathing tiger, but an affectionate and playful cat. She pointed a shocked finger at the surprised monster, and hysterically asked what happened to it. Sierra, standing nearby, noted that the most difficult way to defeat a monster is to tame it. Aisha exclaimed enthusiastically, clapping her hands, that it was the first time she had seen a person do something like that. Kyle's eyes narrowed. He thought this was some kind of nonsense. He was seriously angry. Not only was he fighting, but these two were just lucky to meet a harmless animal. Meanwhile, Yolman and Arya were squatting next to the tamed tiger and scratching its belly. The long-haired magician walked up to Lu and said loudly that he was really jealous of him. Arya looked up at the guy. He asked with a wry smile why Lu was so lucky. Because he had met a harmless tiger. The apostle's partner stood up abruptly, attacking Kyle with accusations. At this time, the rest of the students also began to be indignant, saying that Kyle was right. Their team came across a very angry tiger. Some were even wounded during the battle. Yolman smiled and said that it was all about his magic, in the magic called Taming the Beast. Hearing this, Charlotte widened her eyes, staring at the guy. Kyle rolled his eyes. He had never heard of such talent magic. Could Lu demonstrate it to everyone to prove his words? The apostle grinned in response to this. The tiger lying on its back immediately stood up. All the tigers that took part in the test began circling Yolman. The crowd buzzed. What's going on with these fire cats? The apostle did not answer, and only looked to the side. As if on command, the entire pride lay down on the floor and bent in something like a bow in front of Yolman. He's smiling from ear to ear, quoted the saying, if you see it, you won't believe it, but if you haven't seen it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Hearing this, Kyle was overcome with anger of defeat and not understanding what was happening. Aisha seemed speechless from what she saw. Arya could also only open and close her mouth, silently watching what was happening. This pervert was hiding such power. The crowd was silent. The students just looked at Yolman with all their eyes. This scene was interrupted by Sierra. She had had enough. She created a magical circle of fire in the air. For today, the test was over, and all the tigers disappeared in the whirlpool of the magic circle. The teacher approached Lu and sternly asked when he would register his magic talent. The guy scratched his cheek and replied that no one asked him to do this. Charlotte took her leave and apologized to the students, as she urgently needed to visit the academic affairs department and add new information there. The girl dismissed the students, and she went to the exit. But the apostle thought that, fortunately for him, in one of the human novels that he read, there is the magic of talent taming, which means Sierra should not suspect anything. The sun illuminated the academy's courtyards. Arya, Yolman and Aisha were walking along the alley. Arya hit the guy hard on the shoulder and exclaimed that she did not expect such a pervert to have such strength, and that he was great. The apostle was indignant at this and asked not to call him that, because he had a name Lu. Aisha laughed softly, listening to their argument. The fun was interrupted by Kyle, who appeared in front of them. He dryly turned to Yolman that he now understood what kind of magic talent is, and it is not surprising that Cerberus did not attack him from the entrance test. The other students, hearing this, looked at each other. It really seemed like the truth. The apostle sighed. Well, it started again. The warriors continued to talk. Someone said that with the ability to control the summoned beast, that guy could send Cerberus to attack the others. He was told that Lu could deliberately do this in order to be able to touch the goddess. The apostle was amazed at how much human imagination can be developed. Arya spoke out in his defense, loudly saying that this couldn't happen, because if Cerberus had been set on the students, would they have been able to get through in that case? This made sense. The warriors did not know what to answer. Aisha could not tolerate injustice, and said that the magic of talent requires great abilities and long training. Besides, the wind barrier that time was unlikely to be able to withstand Cerberus, and Lu saved her, and the girl feels only gratitude. She expressed the hope that students will not make incorrect assumptions. Kyle growled at Aisha's words. She said that the wind barrier could not withstand. What impudence. The guy's fists involuntarily clenched, ready to fall on the enemy, whom they were also defending. He couldn't believe that the student was lying to help that freak. Yolman sincerely thanked the blushing Aisha, to which Arya jealously reminded of herself. There was silence in the director's office, interrupted only by the ticking of the large grandfather clock. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the director allowed him to enter. Sierra literally flew into the room with the words that she had found him, a man with the magic of taming talent. Aces straightened up in his chair in surprise, his clasped fingers tensed. The man clarified how strong the animals this student could control. Charlotte thought for a moment and answered, "It's not clear yet. It seems that he can instantly tame a beast like Cerberus. Aces ordered the teacher to find out this as quickly as possible. The trio of newfound friends strolled lazily around the building. Arya stretched sweetly, regretting that the time of rest was over so quickly. Aisha, studying the scroll in her hand, noticed that, if she was not mistaken, the class would be studying history today. When Lu asked again, she replied that she had heard that it was a subject that delved deeply into many major historical events. Yolman's eyebrows drew together, and he hoped that they wouldn't talk about the cities he bombed. Suddenly Arya saw Sierra and greeted her. Aisha and Yolman looked at each other. The guy drooped. He had a bad feeling. Charlotte immediately, without any ceremony, called the student to the court tower. The court tower inside was decorated with statues of 4 beautiful maidens on columns located around the arena with signs inscribed on it. Sierra and Lu found themselves right in the center of the arena. The area was also illuminated by 4 multicolored magic balls on high stands. Yolman smiled awkwardly. I wonder why Miss Sierra brought him to this place. The girl replied that she wanted to ask the student a question. Suddenly, a circle of fire formed around the arena, and the teacher herself rose into the air, and said her name in warning, then said that she would ask her question only once. Will Lu become the Fire Witch's apprentice? The guy was taken aback. It was very sudden. Sierra smiled triumphantly in advance. She was sure that no one would refuse to be the student of the great imperial magician. But her expectations were not met. Yolman crossed his arms in front of him, apologized, and refused. At first, the Fire Witch did not realize what exactly the guy answered. She smiled and asked to wait a little. But then the realization hit her mind. Sierra screamed, pointing her finger at Lu, who stood calmly. She was beside herself and shouted at Yolman, unable to believe that he dared to refuse. The guy rolled his eyes once again. Yes, he is only here to find a wife, and is not going to become someone's apprentice and work hard. Suddenly his eyes sparkled. Lu thought out loud that there was no rule prohibiting a student and teacher from getting married, but Charlotte did not support this idea, warning the student not to even think about it. The apostle exhaled in disappointment. What a pity. He turned around and waved his hand, telling Sierra to forget about it. The witch, irritated, clenched her teeth. She ironically asked how Lu even planned to find a wife with his status. The girl invited him to remember how the guy lived before he got to this academy. Yolman lowered his head and indulged in memories of the time when he first came into the world of people. Huge price tags, larger than the records of the apostles. He passed by shop windows, and was horrified by the prices of ordinary cakes. A large commission that took most of his coins. He vividly imagined Aisha running away from him into the distance because he was too poor and therefore they could not be together. Yolman raised his head to the ceiling and screamed in horror that this would never happen. Sierra smiled contentedly. She still managed to appeal to the student's voice of reason. She raised her finger up and offered a deal. If Lu became her student, he would gain status and access to her property. She ascended upward again, and fire began to blaze around her, and fiery flashes also erupted from her hands. The witch asked her question again. Is Lu ready to become Sierra Charlotte's apprentice? Without turning around, the apostle's voice rang out, asking Miss Sierra if she really thought that this was the only way to convince him. Turning around, he smiled wickedly, and at the same moment, like a child, he ran with a squeal to the teacher. He agreed to become a student of the Master Sierra. The witch was loudly indignant when she realized that Lu had simply jumped and grabbed her leg. The next moment they both fell to the floor, Yolman tightly hugging his teacher's hips with both hands. The guy also demanded encouragement from the master. At that same second, various magical symbols and constellations began to appear on the ceiling, shimmering in blue. The immobilized Sierra said that the student might not bow to her, and he should have already unhooked from her. An absolutely happy Yolman, without letting go of Sierra, asked what was wrong with the student holding the master's hips. Suddenly, fiery flashes began to burst out along the entire perimeter of the circle in which they lay. The apostle looked around in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The flashes became larger and larger, and were now jumping all over the hall, like sunbeams. Sierra hissed that Lu was an idiot. Finally, they were both covered with a dome of fire, and one of the statues on the column said in a dull voice that the contract had been concluded. Yolman felt his forehead feel hot. A mark appeared there that looked like a small fiery dragon. He slapped himself with his palm. Something strange had happened to his forehead. Sierra, freed from the hug, was beside herself with rage. She grabbed the apprentice by the scruff of the neck and began shouting that when a contract is made between a master and an apprentice, A mark of the contract appears in the place where they touched. The guy, embarrassed, quietly noticed that Charlotte had not warned him. The witch, realizing that nothing could be changed, sighed and released the unlucky student. Wearily putting her hand to her face, she said that, in any case, this mark does not appear just like that. Yolman, hearing this, jumped up and down enthusiastically, asking if this meant that Sierra's mark was on her thigh. But the girl ordered him to get away. A day later in the academic cafeteria, 2 students from Sierra's class were talking among themselves. They were discussing Lu's invitation to the court tower yesterday, and the fact that it seemed that he had not returned from there yet. Arya and Aisha couldn't stomach it. The girls sadly thought about the fate of their friend. Arya belligerently exclaimed that in the court tower, the Royal Academy judges and punishes students. Aisha clutched the hem of her dress, nervously protesting that the guy had done nothing wrong. Kyle, who approached them, intervened in the conversation. He laughed when he heard what the girls were talking about. He smiled evilly and said that Lu must have lied about his taming talent magic, and it was discovered, and now the lower strata are worried about each other. Raising an eyebrow, he added that he must have been expelled yesterday. After all, trash is still trash. Arya jumped up from the table and loudly, screaming, asked him what the hell he was talking about. Aisha tried to calm her classmate, but she failed. Kyle could not stop, and threw mud at the student, calling them, like Lu, trash. The blonde witch tried to protect the apostle. She objected to Kyle that he himself had seen the magic of Lu's talent with his own eyes, and it would be better for him to watch his words. At that moment Yolman's voice was heard. He asked if everyone was talking about him. Kyle, narrowing his eyes, looked carefully at the guy who entered. The apostle, as always, was calm and kept his hands in his pockets. He said that he had only been gone one night, but they had already missed each other at the same time. He pressed his back against the wall and languidly put his palm to his forehead. The guy had an impressive bag of money hanging on his belt. Aisha jumped out from the table and rushed to Lu. He clapped his hands. His little sister, as always, remained a cutie. Arya put her hands on her hips and said reproachfully that Lu was still just as lustful. The guy repelled the attack with a smile, calling his partner still just as cruel and active. With her hands folded across her chest, Arya, with feigned indifference, asked Lu to tell him why teacher Sierra took him away yesterday. Kyle, whom no one had asked, butted in again, mockingly asking what the student and teacher were doing there. He assumed that Lu had been expelled from the academy. Aisha sobbed, "This is not true." The apostle arched an eyebrow and looked at the offender. Then he raised his head high and said that Master Sierra had entered into a contract with him. In the dining room, where most of the students were intently following the progress of the conversation, silence reigned. All eyes were focused on Lu, a contract between master and student. The apostle summoned magical streams of fire. That same mark appeared on his forehead. It would prove to everyone that the guy was not lying. Kyle, pretending to be unimpressed, said that even if his classmate had the magic of taming animals, he was just lucky that there were animals on the test, because if it were different, would he have gotten into Ace's class? The guy bared his teeth and invited Lu to fight him. Kyle Smith. Aisha could not remain silent when her savior was insulted, so, clenching her fists, she replied that even so, Lu has the magic talent sufficient to enter the Ace class. The apostle looked admiringly at the girl who defended him so zealously. The long-haired magician sharply moved his palm, causing a magical flow of air. He, like a knife, rushed towards Aisha and cut off several strands of her hair. Lu and Arya immediately grouped up and ran up to their friend. Kyle, shaking his palm, sharply told the offended witch not to interfere in someone else's conversation when she was not asked to do so. Arya ran up to Aisha, excitedly asking if she was okay. The girl timidly nodded. The apostle moved closer to Kyle to talk. He agreed to fight the magician. Then, a spark ran through the red eyes. He seriously asked Mr. Kyle to be gentle with him. The wind currents created by Kyle gradually dissipated. He and Lu now stood opposite each other, each looking at the other with his eyes. Yolman folded his arms across his chest and asked what the rules and conditions of their fight would be. Smith replied that he would release the maximum of his energy and strike. If Lu survives, it means victory, and if he loses, he will immediately leave the Ace class. Arya clenched her fist. What a vile magician this is. Now there is not a single monster there. This is completely unfair to Lu. Aisha, frightened, did not say anything, only looked pitifully at Lu. Yolman was not at all afraid. he said with a smile that Mr. Kyle looked confident. He laughed mockingly right in his classmate's face. At first he continued to stand motionless. Then air magic runes formed in the air. From the small whirlwind that appeared, the magician took out a superbly constructed sword. The apostle raised his eyebrows in surprise. Aisha, who had retreated to a safe distance, stood at the stands, but when she saw the appearance of weapons, she jumped up and shouted that this could not happen. Arya, who was standing behind her, asked what was the matter. The witch, looking somewhere into the distance, told a legend. One day, the ancestor of the Bolette family received an elemental gift from the king, countless amounts of gold and silver that did not fit in the carved chests, and one of the rarest treasures is a magic sword. Aisha wondered if she remembered the exact name of the weapon. It was him, that same famous and unattainable Excalibur. Yolman smiled slyly, saying that Kyle had an interesting sword. He, biting his index finger, set new conditions. If he lost, he would not only leave the class, but also leave the academy. Holding Excalibur in front of him, the blonde responded defiantly that Lou had finally realized that he didn't belong here. Yolman ignored the attack, but offered to get his sword from Kyle if he won. The magician tensed when he heard such a proposal, not that he was unsure of himself. At the podium, Arya screamed in her usual manner, calling Lou a pervert and wanting him to deal with Kyle. The apostle broke into a smile and mockingly asked Kyle if he thought he could lose. The wounded blonde clicked his teeth and accepted the conditions. He told his opponent not to blame him for the lack of beasts that could help block Excalibur. Kyle, twirling the sword in his hand, urged Lou not to ask for mercy. Smith, moving the sword in front of him, began to cast spells in the ancient language. Yolman, standing calmly in the same place, watching this, noticed that the weapon released magical energy quite well. The girls caught their breath from the tension hanging in the air. Kyle swung with all his might, and he rushed with his sword to the advantage of the apostle, while using the air sentence spell. Yolman only grinned at this attack. He lazily extended his left hand and held it out in front of Kyle. In a matter of seconds, the apostle created a fiery shield, which Kyle, unsuspecting, hit with all his might with his sword. The magician exhaled in shock. The streams of air from his magic covered Aisha and Arya with their heads. The air cloud completely hid the battlefield and the fighting students. The girls leaned forward, trying to at least make out something. Who is who? Kyle looked blankly in front of him. How could this bastard? The apostle, hiding his eyes under his bangs, said that they should not waste time. Smith stared in shock at his opponent. Lou, meanwhile, was already holding the sword in his hands, carefully stroking the blade, saying that he would accept Excalibur. He mockingly continued, thanking Mr. Kyle for his generosity and gift, while Kyle stood opposite him and furiously clenched and unclenched his fists. Arya and Alicia, jumping up and down with anticipation, loudly asked Lou if he was okay. Yolman turned his head to Kyle, recalled the attack towards Aisha, and expressed hope that this would not happen again. At the same time, his red eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. The blonde still seemed unable to accept his defeat and looked at Lou with wide eyes. Yolman, seeing how the enemy was approaching him again, sharply extended his right hand, without releasing Excalibur from his left. A powerful fiery blow struck Kyle's chest, and he was thrown back. The guy spat out blood from his mouth. Such was the strength of the enemy's spell. Smith flew quite a distance, and in the end, with a deafening roar, it hit the opposite wall, partially destroying it. Aisha and Arya opened their mouths in shock. Kyle lay defeated, spitting out more and more blood. Yolman lowered his hand and smiled. Well, that's all. The clouds of dust cleared and everyone saw Kyle, bloodied, lying on the floor. He got up on all fours, spitting out blood again. The magician raised his head, and a veil of rage covered his eyes. This is impossible. Yolman smiled contentedly, examining Excalibur, and said that he was taking it. The answer was Smith's furious look. At that moment, Lou was called out. He turned around and saw Arya and Aisha running. Arya couldn't believe her eyes. She excitedly asked if Lou was really taking Excalibur. Aisha, smiling sweetly, praised her classmate, saying that he turned out to be stronger than she thought. He blushed and replied that he was actually very strong. Arya had another brilliant idea and raised her index finger. The girls suggested throwing a party in honor of Lou's victory, since they didn't have any more classes for today anyway. Yolman's eyes sparkled. He imagined an incredible amount of varied food, and was already looking forward to trying it. The trio turned to leave, shouting slogans of victory along the way. A thin stream of blood flowed down Klein's chin. He thought with horror what would happen to him if his father found out about the loss of Excalibur. Then he took a deep breath into his lungs and, shouting as much as he could, ordered the students to stop. Yolman stopped and turned around. Wiping his chin with the back of his hand, the fair-haired magician told the apostle that he could not give this sword to him. Aisha spoke up. She recalled that this was a condition to which Smith agreed, and she hoped that the guy would be able to keep his word. Klein, annoyed, shouted that Lou had definitely cheated somehow, and just to be fair, the sword must be returned. Yolman firmly replied that he refused. Smith was amazed at such audacity. He immediately began to create magical currents of air, thereby announcing the battle. A large ball formed in the hands of the magician, an accumulation of his forces and a powerful weapon. The guy shouted to Lou, even if he didn't think that he would leave this sight unscathed. The trio found themselves right in the middle of a raging wind whirlwind. Arya said loudly through the noise of the wind that Cain would definitely not allow himself to lose his sword, but a retaliatory strike was already levitating in Yolman's palm, magical fire clots. He, smiling, assured that nothing would work out for Smith. The apostle gripped the hilt of the sword more tightly with his second hand. He glanced down. He felt some kind of energy from outside. Kyle again created a vortex of air around himself, and told Lou that he would spare him if he obediently returned the sword to him. He arched his eyebrow and asked what would happen if he refused. Then Smith roared that the student would die on the spot. He was so angered by Lou's arrogance that he created one of his most powerful spells, the Wind Whirlwind Blade. The apostle watched the brewing storm with an unreadable expression on his face. The girls prepared to shield themselves from the wind with their hands. But suddenly, Kyle's magic connected with something previously unknown to those present. The area around them was filled with a bright, green color, and Kyle screamed in shock, asking what was happening. Excalibur, which now rose above the warring parties, shone brighter than the sun. The tip of the handle with the precious stones shimmered and began to pulsate. Yolman stood closest to the light source and looked at it unblinkingly. Aisha covered her eyes with her palms, unable to bear the glow. The apostle chuckled in surprise when he saw what was happening. In place of the sword, a cocoon formed, which rotated at great speed. It was possible to distinguish the outlines of a person who was sitting inside in a fetal position. A few moments later, the cocoon dissipated and a girl with green hair appeared to those present. Her clothes were in the same colors and details as Excalibur earlier. The stranger landed softly on the floor. Bending one knee, she lowered her head in front of Yolman and introduced herself. The girl was the embodiment of the sword of the king of the elements named Sylph, and she welcomed the new owner. Arya leaned forward, amazed, and asked her what kind of sword she was talking about. Aisha opened her mouth in silent surprise. Kyle, too, can't utter a word from what he saw. Sylph flew closer to the apostle. He thoughtfully rested his chin on his index finger, and asked if the girl was the spirit of this magical sword. She nodded and replied that, according to her agreement with Kyle, now she, the sword of the king of the elements, would belong to Lou. Sylph also clarified whether she could find out about her master's wishes. Arya noticed that the sword had a spirit. No wonder it was considered a precious treasure. Yolman scratched the back of his head and first asked Sylph to stand up. She obediently obeyed. Kyle was now no longer conscious of rage. The magician jumped up and ran to the spirit, saying that he was her master. The girl turned around upon hearing these words. The magician continued, waving his arms, shouting that he definitely would not have lost to that guy if she had shown up earlier, and Sylph ordered to return to him immediately. Arya put her hands on her hips and said in disappointment that Kyle was really so shameless to say such a thing. Aisha was silent, and only nodded at her friend's words. Yolman turned to the spirit, deciding that it would be better if she weighed everything herself, and asked if the girl wanted to return. Sylph said a firm no. Raising her head, she recalled that at the beginning of the fight the conditions were agreed upon. Looking straight into Kyle's eyes, the spirit continued that the old owner bet her and lost, which naturally led to the owner changing, and now only Sylph herself decides whether to change the owner or not. The magician was beside himself with surging rage and powerlessness. Yolman stepped forward and, with barely concealed disgust in his voice, asked Kyle to stop humiliating himself even more, now that Sylph had explained everything. He was silent, only his eyes betrayed his state of growing desire for revenge. Suddenly the apostle turned around, as if he remembered something important. He approached the spirit of Excalibur, patted her on the top of her head, and asked her forgiveness for using her as a bet. When the girl opened her eyes wide, because no one had clearly apologized to her before, Yolman asked if she would help him in the future. Sylph blushed deeply. This owner was not like the others. She happily agreed, smiling widely. Kyle's caustic laughter filled the space. He clenched his fists, looked angrily at the guys, and warned that he should not be underestimated. Using rune magic, he quickly created a red tornado. Wind currents, fueled by his anger, swirled dangerously around the owner. Kyle's face showed veins as he shouted that a member of the Smith family couldn't allow himself to be insulted by such scum. The guy raised his hands up. The tornado was still spinning around the owner, now adding fiery flashes around the perimeter. The next moment, a burning phoenix of incredible size flew up. Arya, blinded by its light, leaned back. She was afraid that such a monster would not leave even a piece of this place. Yolman smiled, urging not to worry. The sword spirit grabbed her new owner's hand in desperation. Looking into his eyes, Sylph devotedly asked to be used in battle. The apostle was delighted with such zeal, agreed, and asked the girl to lend her strength. The phoenix, opening its huge beak, rushed from a height at Yolman, who was on alert and was already creating magical waves of his magic. The guy clutched Excalibur in his hand, ready to attack. His eyes sparkled predatorily in anticipation of victory. Yolman only had to wave his sword a few times for the fiery bird to disappear into the air. There was a loud explosion, Kyle's own destroyed magic throwing him back. Aisha and Arya managed to put up a translucent shield in front of them at the last moment. A few seconds later, the apostle stood on the rubble. Lowering his sword, his left hand habitually rested in his pocket. Pressing her hands to her chest, Aisha peered into the thick fog from the destruction of the stone floor and magic. Arya looked around with delight, her mouth open in admiration. Kyle, disheartened and covered in bruises, lay on the floor. Now it was all over for him. Some time later, Yolman and his companions came to the restaurant. The seated guests, mostly fellow students from the academy, turned their attention to the loud group. Arya grabbed the menu from the counter and waved it in the air, happily suggesting they celebrate their victory over Kyle. The company sat down at a large table, which was soon filled with various dishes, which the waiters quickly brought. Particularly eye-catching were the appetizing and bright desserts, of which there were no less than main courses and appetizers. Sylph thoughtfully rested her chin on her hand, deciding what to start with first. She had never seen such food before. Aisha smiled and told the girl sitting opposite that the food prepared in this restaurant is very tasty, and you should definitely try it. Yolman's hair literally rose on his head with delight, and an idea came to mind. Now he would get a chance to win Aisha's heart. Getting serious, he asked his friend if she knew how to eat it in a way that would taste better, the interested which suggested that he should eat the dish while it was warm. The guy was in awe of his genius. Directing a playful glance at Aisha, the apostle explained, "You need to feed a person from a spoon." The poor girl's face flushed with embarrassment. Arya, distracted from eating, slowly turned to Yolman and said that she suddenly felt full. Meanwhile, in her office as the deputy director, Sarah sat at the table and was extremely focused on something. She used magic to make the paper figures in the shape of men move and acted out the earlier scene of an argument between Kyle and Yolman. Taking the small sword from the hand of the figurine, apparently personifying Yolman, she thoughtfully concluded that, ultimately, Kyle lost his Excalibur to a student named Lou. The little man actively waved his paper head at her from the table. Sarah exhaled in irritation and ordered the figure to report this to Sierra and Director Aces. They would jointly decide what to do. The deputy was worried that sword has a spirit, which means the Smith family won't just leave it like that. Night fell and the students returned to their rooms in the dorm building. Yolman stretched out on the bed with a dreamy look. Thoughts lazily replaced one after another. At first the apostle thought about the amazing ability of people to create delicious dishes from simple ingredients. Then the cheeks flushed when the image of Aisha appeared in my head. Today she was so sweet and gentle. And what will happen if the apostle takes her as his wife, and they live in his castle? The fantasy of the strongest apostle. Yolman painted him Aisha in a cute apron, and with a plate of pie in her hands. The girl innocently asked whether Yolman would eat the food she had prepared, or would he first eat his wife. The level of passion in his blood went off scale. The guy began to rock on the bed, blinded by such a bright game of the mind. The green top of the sword spirit appeared inopportunely by the bed, emotionlessly stating that it seemed its owner was very happy. Yolman squealed like a girl and crawled under the blanket in surprise. How did Sylph manage to scare him so much and appear so suddenly? The girl lowered her eyes guiltily and apologized. She suddenly felt strong fluctuations in the owner's emotional state, and therefore appeared without permission. The apostle felt sorry for the spirit. Looking at the girl's upset face, he said that everything was fine. Then he ruffled Sylph's hair and asked her to warn her about her appearance next time, especially in the form of a human. She seriously asked why the owner was happy. The guy looked dreamily out the window. He was happy because spring had come to him, and everything was seething inside. The girl raised her index finger up. This is very similar to the desire for physiological needs that she has heard about. Yolman turned away, drooped, and replied that it was almost the same thing. Suddenly he felt a spirit tugging at his shirt. The apostle turned around in surprise, staring at Sylph. Shyly raising her eyes, she muttered that she was not too sure, but maybe she could help the owner with his condition. The question finally brought Yolman to his senses. He, blushing, exclaimed that this was not very good, and the spirit again, without unnecessary emotions, reminded of her purpose to help the owner. Coughing into his fist, the apostle assumed a doomed look, and yet allowed himself to help if the girl sincerely wanted it herself. Scissors appeared in the spirit's hand. The guy chuckled incomprehensibly, staring at the object. Sylph, looking bored, snapped her scissors in the air and announced that it would hurt, but she would try to be gentle. Yolman only now realized how recklessly he had behaved, and apologized profusely to the girl. At this time, Sierra Charlotte was sitting on her bed in her bedroom with a pile of papers in her hands. She muttered thoughtfully to herself about the discrepancy between the surnames of one of the students and the general. Suddenly, Yolman's personal file caught the girl's eye. She stared at the student's photo for a long time, wondering how he defeated Kyle Smith today. The witch decided to ask Lou personally at the meeting tomorrow, and put the documents aside. The last one on top was Aisha's case. The next day, Sierra called the student into her office. The sun was shining brightly through the floor-to-ceiling window, its rays playfully jumping across the flasks and test tubes arranged in the office. But Charlotte's face did not express the joy of meeting Lou's student. She sat opposite him, gloomier than a cloud. The next moment, the witch stood up abruptly and slammed her fists on the table. Leaning on it, the apostle nervously jumped up in his chair. Bending low to Yolman, she screamed right in his face, asking why the student ran to the cafeteria to brag about their contract, and later started a duel with Kyle. The witch sat down in the chair again, but was still angry. Lou seemed to be deliberately creating problems for her. He raised his hands up in defense and asked the master to calm down. Anyway, sooner or later they would have found out about it. Sierra stood up and walked around the table. Putting her hands on her hips, she demanded an explanation about the duel with Kyle. The apostle made wide eyes and began to lament that Smith was the first to propose a duel, and looked at him so angrily at that moment, as if he wanted to kill him. Moreover, the magician was very arrogant and used various tricks during the battle, but fortunately, thanks to his strength, Lou was able to easily defeat the impudent man. Charlotte had a flash of thought that her student was arrogant, especially now. The witch looked suspiciously at Lou and asked how he was able to master the magic of the taming talent, because when concluding a mutual contract between master and student, she felt only the guy's basic magic, without the attribute. To this, Yolman playfully raised his finger up and revealed that he had all the skills by nature. It was painful to look at Sierra. She dejectedly thought about how stupid her student was. The witch turned her back to Yolman, stood by a large bookcase, studying the spines of books. She advised the student to get into less trouble and study the attributes of magic. Grabbing a particularly large book, Charlotte ordered Lou not to call her master because it made her feel like an old woman. He, smiling widely, invited her to become his wife instead of the master. The answer was a blow to the head with a thick tome. Sierra, towering over him, asked him to repeat the sentence with a special intonation. With a lump growing on his head, Yolman became more accommodating and said that he would stop calling the girl a master. A little later, Sierra met the director on a picturesque street of the academy. They stood under the treetops and talked. The witch thanked Aces for resolving the issue with Excalibur. She said with concern that the Smith family couldn't find him. The old man said that Kyle's skills were not that good, and the loss of Excalibur was well deserved. In addition, his family should not think that since they are stronger, everything is allowed to them. He looked at Charlotte seriously and said that the Smiths knew about Lou's student status. Sierra should take the guy with her to a magic meeting next week. The witch replied that she would try to improve his skills until then. Aces smoothed his long beard and smiled. The older Sierra gets, the more polite she communicates. He suddenly remembered how she came to him when she was very little, having said with affection that now his pupil is already an adult and independent. The old man coughed annoyingly into his fist. The girl immediately ran up to the director, frightenedly asking what was wrong with him. But he replied that it was nothing special, the years were just taking their toll. The witch looked at Aces with a frustrated look, holding him by the elbow. The old man patted the girl on the hand soothingly and advised her not to worry, but rather to concentrate on the magic congress. After all, perhaps there will be a chance to awaken her magic talent. Charlotte replied that in this case she would be able to help the director, and he would not be so tired. Aces smiled into his beard. He will look forward to this day. Meanwhile, Yolman was leafing through textbooks in the academic library. Sylph accompanied him like a faithful servant. The guy, sitting cross-legged right on the floor, was especially interested in one book. He muttered thoughtfully that he had not known until now about the use of attributes by people for the functionality of natural elements. Sylph approached the owner and handed him a cup of green tea, because the coffee that Yolman asked for was not there. The apostle smiled, gratefully accepting the drink, assuring that the tea was also very tasty. The girl knelt down next to him and looked devotedly into his eyes. He was surprised by the sudden attention and asked what was the matter. Sylph asked why her master does not tell anyone the truth, because he is actually very strong. Yolman took a sip of tea before answering. Lowering his head, he explained with sadness in his voice, when power goes beyond the understanding of people, they begin to be afraid and try to please in every possible way. The apostle remembered the days when he defeated entire armies of monsters single-handedly, and at that time everyone stayed away from him. Grateful people knelt down, right on the ground drenched in enemy blood, and greeted the first apostle Yolman. One day he noticed a beautiful girl bending at his feet. Yolman, flashing a smile from under his deep hood, invited the beautiful stranger to admire the moon with him. But she, with tears in her eyes, frightened by the greatness of the guy, did not respond to the invitation. Yolman looked at her with a disappointed look. His hand dropped lifelessly. Then Sylph asked if her master had any acquaintances like himself. The apostle replied that they were, but they have been traveling for a very long time, and it is not known where they are now. Despite everything, Yolman raised his head and smiled, even blushed a little. Now he felt like an ordinary person, just like everyone else. The sword spirit wondered if there were any misunderstandings between the master and the common people. On the streets of the academy, students were already gossiping with all their might about the Fire Witch's new ward. There were even suggestions that they were just a couple. The guy with a prickly look denied this, because he personally saw the mark of the master and student on his forehead. His interlocutor, with no less venom in his voice, replied that only a couple of lovers could engrave the mark directly on the forehead. Aisha listened to these conversations, and surprise and sadness became more and more mixed in her soul. It was getting dark, and lights were coming on in the windows of the student dormitories. Sierra walked down the corridor, carrying a tray with a bun and tea in her hands. She remembered that she had forgotten to remove the magic seal from the entrance, and what only a stupid student could learn during this time. Approaching the door, she ran her hand over the seal, removing it. Upon entering, she asked how Lou was doing, but found an interesting picture. Her lazy student not only didn't study, he lay on little Sylph's lap while she stroked his head. A random student passing by Yolman's window jumped to the side from the sudden fiery flash reflected in the glass. It was the angry Sierra who taught Yolman a lesson, who now sat on his knees with the spirit of Excalibur, and asked the master for forgiveness. Charlotte had not seen Sylph yet, and now asked with interest whether she was the same sword spirit. The girl bowed down, introduced herself, and asked the witch to become her mentor. Charlotte's eyes widened when she heard the sweet voice. She immediately noted her cuteness, as soon as she saw the girl, while Yolman cast surprised glances at both. To hide her embarrassment, Sierra coughed into her fist and said that she had come to tell them about her participation in the capital's magical congress, which would be held in a week. Yolman rolled his eyes and asked who came up with the name, because it sounded too sweet. Sierra's face became darker than a cloud. The next moment Yolman sat with a lump on the back of his head, while Sylph waved the notebook in his face like a fan, and asked forgiveness for his incontinence. The witch sat on the chair in front of them, crossing her legs, talking about how the management had no plans to take them there. An accident changed everything, No one could imagine that Lu would get the Smith family's Excalibur. In addition, a sword spirit would emerge from it. Sylph stood up and began to pace the room restlessly. The teacher stood up, crossed her arms over her chest, and continued that this is why the organizers of the Magic Congress, reluctantly, decided to invite them. If they refuse, those around the children may be in danger. Yolman was silent, thinking about what was said. Sierra said seriously, the majority of the Congress would want to put pressure on Lu. He smiled, assuring that his master had nothing to worry about, because who knows who would give to whom else. The grinding of daggers and various types of weapons that the students possessed could be heard from everywhere. During the training battle, Aisha regularly repelled the enemy's blows. She jumped to the side from the next attack and grouped herself correctly so as not to fall. The deputy director, who was observing the students, announced the end of the sparring and allowed them to rest a little. The witch stepped aside, wiping her face with a handkerchief. Conversations could be heard behind them again. Many had not seen Kyle for a long time. A group of guys discussed that the reason for this was his conflict with Lu, and now Kyle is confronting the Fire Witch herself. They could not even think that Lu was clinging to powerful people. Aisha immediately became sad when she heard gossip about her friend. At that moment, a male figure appeared at the entrance to the training hall. The girl looked hopefully in that direction. It was Yolman, who heard all the conversations about himself. He looked up at the gossipers, and said that during his absence from training, too many annoying flies had appeared here. Groups of students rushed about at once, supposedly remembering that the deputy director was calling them, and they needed to leave urgently. Sarah was surprised by the sudden appearance of students near her. Aisha ran up to her friend and asked why he came here. He pulled out a rose from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to the girl, saying that he had come to visit his charming and beautiful Aisha. She blushed and lowered her eyes, and answered that Sylph and teacher Sierra are beautiful and charming. Yolman was very surprised by these words. The witch, having accepted the flower from the guy, sadly explained she heard the students talking about Lu's trip to the capital's Magic Congress. The apostle smoothed his hair, nodding significantly. Running his hand theatrically over the back of his head, he asked Aisha not to be bored in his absence. Arya approached, holding an axe in her hands, ruining the moment. They had not seen each other for only a few days, and no matter how much you feed the wolf, she kept looking into the forest. Yolman, with his hands in his pockets, cheerfully asked his friend if she had already received a scolding during sparring today, to which the girl almost attacked him with her fists. The upset Aisha was still quite amused by the squabble of her classmates. On the tower of the academy, the flag of the educational institution fluttered in the brisk wind. Yolman and Sylph stood in the square next to a large carriage drawn by several white horses. An angry Sierra looked out of the carriage window and called the guys, ordering them not to delay their departure. The apostle turned around and replied that this morning he wanted to have time to say goodbye to his dear Aisha. Sylph added that she checked and it looks like the girl is not in the room. The guy wanted to say something to the teacher, but she interrupted him. Holding the curtain, she said sharply that the student had 3 seconds to get into the carriage. Yolman did not dare to disobey his master, so within a few seconds Aisha watched from her window with trepidation in her chest as the carriage disappeared in the distance. She said Yolman's name with sadness. She was not alone in the room. A black shadow from a magical heavenly portal called her. Aisha, without turning around, realized who was addressing her. The shadow said that now there was no one strong left who could protect this academy, so in the evening she could begin the task given to her by her master. The witch obediently agreed. The shadow noticed what was happening with the girl and voiced her guesses. A guy named Lu loves Aisha very much. This could greatly anger the master. Then the witch turned around for the first time and desperately asked not to tell her father and mother about Lu. The shadow chuckled evilly. Everything will depend on whether Aisha copes with the task. On the way to the event, Sierra told her companions about what awaited them. The annual Capital Magical Congress was held in turn by the 3 main clans, Smith, Jones, Isis. This congress was the main gathering of the world of magicians, where the best of them gathered to discuss achievements, and in general just to socialize. Resting his cheek on his fist, Yolman voiced his discovery. It turns out that the Smith family is one of the 3 main clans. But Charlotte besieged him, warning him that he should not underestimate them. Because the Smiths are the descendants of the heroes who founded the empire, they are second in status only to the imperial family. Sylph did not participate in the conversation. With her head down, she was thinking about something else. The witch continued, the Isis clan controls most of the Empire's military forces, and has outstanding magical skills. The guy, thoughtfully, put his hands behind his head and leaned back on the soft seat, asking what the Jones clan is famous for. His mentor, with the same sternness in her voice, replied that this clan had colonized most of the Empire's trade routes and the pharmaceutical industry, and also owned enormous wealth. The apostle chuckled. It feels like the ruling family of this empire has no control over anything at all. Sierra urged him to be careful, because this time the magical congress was organized by the Jones clan. Yolman laughed. Why should he be afraid? It's just taking part in a banquet. He abruptly changed the topic to a more pleasant one, turning to the spirit of the sword. There will be a lot of delicious dishes at the banquet. They will definitely need to eat their fill. Sylph nodded in agreement in response. The witch exhaled sadly. No changes. Still, she thought, there was one problem with the Jones clan that would be difficult to solve. A few days later, they successfully reached the imperial capital of Guam. The congress was held in a mansion, in front of which there was a large fountain. The butler walked to the carriage door and bowed, announcing that they had arrived at the Jones clan estate. Sierra was the first to step out of the carriage. She was immediately greeted by the clan's maid, bowing in greeting. The butler thanked the witch for coming, saying that the owner had been waiting for her at the gathering place for a long time. Sierra answered sharply, frowning that the man could tell the owner not to bother, because she still had things to do. He became embarrassed, reminding the girl of the special attitude of the owner of the estate towards her. Charlotte gave him a look that was more eloquent than any words. The butler squeaked something and didn't dare say anything else. The witch informed Yolman that he could come in with Sylph and find a place to rest, while she herself would report to Director Aces about her arrival. Charlotte added that the guys should be as quiet as possible. She wanted to say a specific name, but faltered. Then she shook her head and said it didn't matter. The apostle glanced sideways at her in surprise, but the witch waved her off. The witch turned to the maid with a request to show her companions the way. She bowed respectfully. The girl pointed towards the estate and invited the guests to follow her. The student stood thoughtfully as Charlotte walked away. He turned around and looked at the girl's figure, realizing that she was not telling her something. The maid led the guests to the large gates of the estate, inviting them to enter. Inside, everything sparkled and shone. The expensive furnishings screamed about the wealth of the owners. Large tables with snow-white tablecloths were laden with food. Guests in incredibly presentable outfits walked around importantly. Yolman and Sylph looked around, looking for something more delicious to choose. They were not at all interested in the exquisite furnishings of the hall. A lady passing by with disgust covered herself with her fan, complaining that two important magicians from the Smith and Isis families did not arrive. But the townspeople were able to get through, and now they eat and drink at someone else's expense. Meanwhile, the couple had already filled their plates with real lobsters from the very depths, fillet steaks, and enthusiastically commented on their catch, slurping loudly. Suddenly there was a clink of dishes. Someone pushed the maid right onto the table with desserts, loudly calling her a nonentity. This was the owner of the estate, who took out his anger on the servants, because they did not bring Sierra to him, as he ordered. The poor girl's eyes filled with tears. A wound formed on her cheek from the fall. She could not say a word in her defense. The butler gloated. He announced to the owner that he repeated the order to Loina several times to deliver the girl, but she dared to disobey. The apostle, calmly eating from his plate, commented on what he saw, turning to the spirit of the sword. These manipulations are called playing dice. The man turned around sharply, hearing unfamiliar voices, and frowning, realized that he was seeing these guests for the first time. His gaze immediately considered the strangers. Full plates of food, sloppy clothes. This meant only one thing. Commoners had snuck into the estate to eat for free. The man, with feigned politeness, like a cat, slowly approached the strangers, calling them dear guests. He introduced himself, indicating that he represented the Jones family, the hosts of today's event, and asked to see the special invitations by which guests were admitted. The apostle answered directly that they had no invitations. The crowd that had gathered around began to hum with displeasure. Are the guards really eating their bread in vain? It was from these young people, ignorant of etiquette, that the empire ceased to be what it was before. The man dropped his feigned friendliness, and immediately shouted for the guys to leave the banquet immediately. Sylph, without letting go of the plate from her hands, looked at him angrily. It seemed that she was just waiting for the owner's command to teach the emboldened impudent a lesson. Yolman gently pushed her aside and apologized for the misunderstanding, saying that they came here with Master Charlotte, so they did not have invitations with them. But the clan representative became even more angry, wailing that this was nonsense, and his Sierra, so beautiful and outstanding, could not take people like them as students. At this attack, the apostle was surprised that the man called the teacher his own. Those present perked up again. A lady from the crowd whispered to her neighbor that the owner Anthony was still pursuing the fire witch. It's a pity that she didn't reciprocate his feelings at all. The man standing next to him replied that he had heard about Sierra's new student. The owner almost burst with rage after this news. The lady standing next to the maid broke into an insidious smile. This brunette does not know who he is talking to. Having said that he is her student, he himself signed his own death warrant. Yolman waved his fork, saying that if Anthony didn't believe him, he should ask the butler, because he had just met them with Master Sierra. The man immediately dismissed his words, answering that the guy was joking, because Mrs. Sierra was met by the maid Loina. This caused the owner to have a new attack of rage. Clenching his fists, he began to taunt Yolman, saying that he was not fit to be Charlotte's student. The witch's authoritative voice was heard throughout the hall. She, appearing at the door, loudly objected to what was said. The crowd parted and fell silent, letting the guests through and eagerly watching her. Sierra folded her arms across her chest, not at all embarrassed by this reception, and confirmed that the guy had become her student. Anthony laughed awkwardly, saying that he had made a mistake in judgment, and was embarrassed. He approached the witch and bowed, saying that he wanted to make amends by showing her the achievements of magic this year. She shook her head and refused. Then Charlotte grabbed the elbow of Yolman standing next to her. The guy shuddered, looking at the teacher in disbelief. The red-haired witch smiled and, without letting go of the apostle's hand, blurted out that she and the groom would see everything herself, causing shock in Yolman. Not only the student was amazed, everyone around him began to look at each other in shock. Anthony, stuttering, asked the girl what she was talking about. Sierra, without ceasing to smile, confirmed that the guy was not only her student, but also her fiancé, tugging Yolman's hand so that he would play along with her. He turned his head to her and quickly asked in a whisper what was happening. Charlotte just as quietly answered him that the Jones clan had used their influence several times to get her married, and now, since the opportunity had presented itself, the girl would force them to abandon this idea. Yolman did not need to be told twice. He, like Charlotte, smiled radiantly, assented to the idea of looking at the achievements of magic together. Anthony, darker than a cloud, blurted out that it was very short-sighted of the witch to get involved with the poor and refuse his advances. The butler tried to reason with the owner, reminding him that today was the day of the Congress, and all the eyes of people from high society were turned to them. He then gave the couple a scathing look, saying that he had heard that Miss Sierra had no magical achievements to show for this convention. Anthony grinned, pleased to hear this. He tried to defuse the situation by inviting everyone present to try his newest development, a magical medicine. Loud clapping from the crowd could be heard from everywhere. The maids entered the hall in an orderly row, carrying plates in their hands on which stood small glasses of potion. A drink of bright blue light splashed in a small container with every step of the servants. Yolman cast an attentive glance in that direction. The guests, having tasted their portions, whispered in admiration, appreciating the potion. It tastes a little bitter, but even the smallest sip completely replenishes spiritual strength. Anthony smiled and thanked him for the approval, because this was the result of the Jones family's developments over the entire year, a concentrated spirit replenishment potion. Then he looked over his shoulder at the uninvited guests, and as if by chance, said that some people show up at the Congress, eat and drink, without having any magical achievements. That's the real shame. The man winked at Sierra, asking if she agreed with him. Yolman grinned. An idea occurred to him. The guy defiantly knocked over the cup of potion. It splashed out onto the expensive parquet floor in front of the stunned crowd. The owner gasped for air, outraged by such an act. At this the apostle chuckled and apologized. His hand only trembled. Charlotte couldn't resist and sprayed into her fist. Anthony, his eyes wide, attacked Yolman with accusations. He poured out a potion brewed in ideal proportions, and how many rare ingredients were used. The guy, rolling the cup in his hands, calmly listed all the ingredients: shining stone powder, basilisk scales, angelica, and the purest water from under the polar ice. The shocked man stared at Yolman, speechless from what he heard. Yolman did not stop. He continued with mockery that he could make a box of such swill in a day, and Anthony also calls this potion the latest development with ideal proportions. As if wound up, Anthony shouted that he worked hard for a whole month to create this potion, achieved the perfect balance, and the rogue dares to say with his dirty mouth that this is swill, then let him make a box of the potion today, as promised. Sierra immediately approached the student, calling him stupid and scolding him for his long tongue, but he calmed her down. He whispered that the girl needed help in some areas. She listened and agreed. Charlotte then asked how he knew the ingredients and method of preparing the potion, to which the apostle hesitated for a moment. The faithful spirit of the sword came to his aid, who quickly blurted out that it was she who suggested all the components to the owner. Yolman laughed with relief. That's exactly how it was. The fire witch thought for a moment, since the girl was part of Excalibur, it is not surprising that she can sniff out the ingredients of the potion by the smell of the potion, while behind Sierra's back Yolman and Sylph high-fived each other for teamwork. One of the long tables was cleared especially for the apostle, and the ingredients, knife, board and cooking utensils were left there. Anthony mockingly addressed the guy, supported by the laughter of the crowd. Shining stone powder, carrots, chestnuts, sorurus, so many products from the market. Is he really ready to prepare a potion for everyone? Yolman answered him with a meaningful look. He effectively threw off his cloak, and remaining in only his shirt, tied an apron around his waist, as if he did this every day. The guy heated the vat and added more fire for a better effect. Literally a few minutes later, a potion was already splashing in the bowl, no different in color or consistency from what Anthony had been brewing for so long. Those present deeply inhaled the aromas emanating from the vat, commenting on what they felt. Such a clean smell, as if you were transported to nature, and your heart was so serene. The man denied everything, because cooking was not so simple. Some special waves emanated from Yolman, confident in his abilities, standing in the center of the table near the boiling vat. The liquid in the cauldron looked truly impressive. There was no doubt that this was the same legendary potion. The audience was amazed by the skill of the young magician. Meanwhile, Yolman was already pouring portions of the steaming liquid into glass containers. The potion, like spring water, shimmered in the edges of the glass. Finally, the apostle asked everyone to come to the table. The potion was already ready. An unfamiliar, stately man approached him first, politely asking if he could try the potion. Sierra respectfully greeted the newcomer. It was Professor Maitland himself from the Imperial University of Potions. He was known on a par with the chief magician aces. Yolman smiled good-naturedly and nodded. The professor held the glass in his hand with both hands and took a leisurely sip, savoring every sip. At first his face showed no emotion, but a moment passed, and he opened his eyes wide. Maitland exclaimed in shock that he would never have thought that he would meet a person who would make a superpower potion. Anthony asked in shock, wasn't the super strength potion, which increases spiritual power several times, lost almost 300 years ago? The man, still not believing what he had just learned, agreed, but he himself had never heard of this method of preparing a potion, so how was this young man able to learn the secret of preparation? He placed the empty cup on the table. Then he bowed to Yolman, saying that he would give half of everything he had to find out how to create this potion. There was silence as the guy thought about the words he had spoken. The apostle smiled slyly, just half. The professor nodded and promised, if that wasn't enough, to add more. Some gentlemen exclaimed that this would be a huge amount, because for this magic potion, lost many years ago, you can return any money invested. Anthony gritted his teeth. He was beside himself with anger. He exclaimed that his Jones clan was also offering half of their wealth for the recipe for this potion. The old professor stared at the man in shock. He stood straight up proudly, because he knew that the fortune of the Jones clan was much greater than that of anyone, and this guy would not be able to resist such a temptation. Yolman, picking his ear with his finger, told the men that he had no plans to sell the recipe. He, grabbing his cloak, turned to Sierra that since they had already looked at the achievements of magic, they could return. The desperate owner shouted after him that he was adding a share of the sales of the potion to half the wealth. The apostle immediately pricked up his ears. Yolman stopped. He was really going to refuse this money. The guy's eyes sparkled with anticipation. There really was a lot of money. Sylph jumped with delight along with him. Charlotte, for the umpteenth time, exhaled in disappointment. Well, who would doubt it? Anthony took them to his office and invited them to a long table, On it stood a box with 3 richly decorated spatial rings. He said that they already contained the required amount of money. This can be checked. The servant picked up the box and brought it to the guests, telling them that after the sales of the potion began, their share would go annually to the account of these rings. Anthony leaned forward and, looking forward to hearing the secret of the preparation, asked how the potion was prepared. Yolman took a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, casually threw it on the table, and replied that the energy contained in a magic potion was never obtained from the ingredients themselves. It was drawn from the coagulation of the elements contained in the air. The man, who did not expect such an answer, grimaced with annoyance and leaned back in his chair. The apostle unfolded the paper with the drawing on it, and explained that a magic circle was engraved in the vat, capable of coagulating the elements of air. Using higher fire magic can successfully cause the magic circle to resonate with the ingredients. As for the ingredients themselves, low-level ingredients have quite low elemental content, so in the magic circle they interact with the highly concentrated elements of the air, seeping out and filling the void. Low-level ingredients not only improve curdling results, they also improve the quality of the elements, which would be more difficult with complex ingredients. Anthony, eagerly peering at the drawing on the sheet, let out a cry of victory. Sierra, clutching a cup in her hands, said that since the Jones clan had learned the secret of the potion, then they had no reason to linger here. The man objected. There was still one matter that they needed to discuss. He asked if Charlotte was aware of the recent eruption of Mount Laertes. The witch nodded, confirming what she had said, just a natural disaster, nothing interesting. But Anthony, smiling, said that he also thought so when the clan sent a rescue group there, until they accidentally discovered traces of a rare magical beast in a mountain cave, a fiery unicorn. Sierra lowered her head, eyes wide at what she heard. Yolman knew that fire unicorns do not live in the east, and asked how the beast ended up in the west. The interlocutor nodded, although it is unknown how the unicorn ended up in their area, but it is safe to say that he is protecting a gem raging with fire. Yolman leaned forward with interest when he heard about the stone. Anthony explained that this gem is probably the untold wealth of Eastern myths, so his clan is sending a group to find the stone, so it can be assumed that Sierra would want to join them. The man folded his arms across his chest and offered a deal. When it all ended, the unicorn would go to Charlotte, and the stone to the clan. The witch surprisingly quickly agreed and asked when the group was leaving. Anthony stood up from the table, indicating a period of 3 days, and invited the guests to stay at the estate, because it was necessary to prepare well before the trip. Yolman smiled at his own thoughts. He had long wanted to see what kind of stone it was. When the strangers left the office, the butler turned to the owner. Not only did he give half his fortune for the recipe for a potion that guy could make in no time, but he also told about the fiery unicorn. This would probably end badly for the clan. Anthony chuckled. He only suggested that they go there, but no one said that Charlotte and her team would be able to return back. The butler clapped his hands and admired what an excellent strategist his master was. The maid led the guests along a long corridor and stopped at an unremarkable door. She apologized that due to the Congress convened these days, all the rooms were occupied. Only one was free. Sierra angrily replied that this one would do and dismissed the maid. Yolman carefully placed Excalibur on the table in the room. With his hands behind his head, he asked the teacher why they were taking a unicorn and not a gem. The girl replied that from the heart of a unicorn you can get blood that can turn any fire received by fire magic into an all-consuming heavenly flame, and by drinking it, you can awaken its natural magic. The apostle cast an interested glance at her. Turning around, the fire witch told Yolman that she took him on as a student only so that he could help her deal with the fire unicorn. She walked to the bed and sat down on the soft bed. The corners of the girl's lips drooped. She regretted that she had acted selfishly. Yolman agreed with her words. Sierra looked at the floor in shock. She did not expect the student to support her self-flagellation. But he immediately spoke again, putting his hands in his favorite pockets. A sly smile appeared on the guy's face. He said that truly selfish people never face a choice. Personally, he himself wants both a pebble and a unicorn. The girl smiled and blushed. What a stupid student she got. She quickly collected her thoughts, became serious again and thought out loud. In 3 days she will need to leave. But now Lou is still weak for this. To prevent something irreparable from happening to her student, all that remains is to transfer some of the magical powers to him. She sat down on the bed again and patted her hand next to her, inviting him to sit down and show her the guy's seal on his forehead. Yolman sat down next to Sierra and pulled her bangs away from her forehead, opening access to the seal, not noticing how the girl blushed. The next moment, she jerked the guy's head towards her, burying his face directly into her thighs. That's where her seal was located. Charlotte exhaled, transferring her powers to the student. She was all illuminated with a bright white glow. Streams of light began to form around the couple, forming large runes on the floor. Holding the boy's head tightly, she again let out a long breath and ordered Lu not to move. A little later, when the ritual ended, she woke up and, looking to the side, quickly spoke. Here it is, this ancient method of transferring magical powers through a seal between the master and the student. Now, having received her powers, the student can use her fire magic. Stuttering, she lowered her head, and with a cry, realized that the guy was still lying on her thigh, not moving. Yolman slowly stood up, holding his head. He leaned back on the bed, quietly answering that he was very comfortable. Anthony sat at the table in his office and asked the butler about what the guests had been doing all 3 days. He replied that they did not even leave the room. Moreover, they could sometimes hear screams coming from there. The owner slammed the table, ordering the servant to remain silent. He straightened up in his chair, exclaiming that he did not understand why he was worse than this brunette. Sierra is simply blind and does not see all the advantages. Suddenly there was a grinding of cutlery on a plate, and a voice from the opposite end of the table. The stranger assured that the gentleman should not worry. Anthony looked puzzled at the hooded man who hid his handsome features and long white hair, and apologized for his tactlessness. He, smiling, asked if Anthony had called him in order to resolve the issue with his fellow travelers. The stranger was the Traveler of the Void Hazidan, one of the 4 best magicians of the Empire, who was considered the only person in history to enter the world of the void. At this time, Sierra continued to teach her student her own magical abilities. Right now Lu was holding a clod of fire in his palm, and asked the master if he was doing everything right. The witch nodded and added that now he can freely use his internal magic. Yolman got a little scared and leaned back when the light flashed brighter right in front of his face. He couldn't even imagine that it was possible to control fire in such a way. Now it's not scary that the flame could break out. Sierra thoughtfully rubbed her chin, either addressing her student or calming herself down, while Yolman drew hearts from the flames behind her. They don't need incidents during the taming of the unicorn, so the transferred magical powers should be enough to withstand fatal blows. Most importantly, not forget that you need to spend your energy wisely. Glancing over her shoulder, and seeing the smart waste of energy, Charlotte cursed under her breath. The voice of the maid was heard outside the door. She asked to hurry, because the cart to Mount Laertes was already ready. You can leave at any time. Sierra immediately opened the door, appearing in front of the girl along with Lu, smeared in soot. Suddenly, the witch caught a peripheral vision of the familiar flaps of the cloak, which disappeared around the bend. Yolman noticed the teacher's hesitation and now looked at her questioningly, but Charlotte was surprised that she saw this man. But she decided that she had made a mistake, so she waved her hand and hurried the student. Late in the evening, a chase took place through narrow corridors in the Tower of St. Joseph. A small figure, wrapped in a thick cloak, maneuvered, trying to hide from his pursuers. But the last turn turned out to be a dead end. Judging by the sounds in the distance, she was about to be overtaken. The figure raised its head, looking at the wall, and breathed loudly, trying to calm its breath, which had been lost from running. Sarah screamed triumphantly when she saw how the stranger hesitated, and shouted to her that there was no way to escape, so she should give back what she stole. The woman, drawing magic runes in the air, demanded that this be done immediately. Magic chains were quickly approaching the figure, ready to bind him at any moment. The stranger turned around, her face hidden by a mask and long blonde hair. She jumped up, dodging the chains. Then she sharply moved to the side and, breaking the window, jumped out into the darkness of the night. Fortunately, the fall was not very high. The girl immediately landed on the ground. The deputy director rushed to the window and looked down. Clenching her fists, she cursed. The stranger still managed to escape. Meanwhile, the figure did not go far, hiding just around the bend. The stranger turned out to be none other than Aisha. She pulled the mask off her face and exhaled with relief. Taking out a carved white box from her bosom, she finally took it out. A few days later, at the foot of the fiery mountain of Laertes, a group of people from the Jones clan and Sierra and her team rushed forward in carts drawn by white horses. the coachman constantly pushing the reins. Suddenly an order was heard from one of the crews to stop. Anthony growled in his carriage again. Yolman jumped out of the next cart like a bullet, covering his mouth with both hands. The rest also had to go outside. Anthony looked reproachfully at Sierra, and said that Lou could have been warned about the state of the road, because due to the constant stops, this one-day trip lasted for several days. The witch awkwardly scratched her cheek. She herself didn't know that the guy would feel so bad after a trip along the mountain path. The apostle, having emptied his stomach, now walked staggering along the road to the carriage, thinking that more than anything in the world he did not want to return there. Suddenly, distant screams caught his attention. Sierra and Anthony turned in the same direction at the same time. One of the clan team was running towards the company, followed by whirlwind lizards, huge reptiles with many spikes on their backs. Anthony did not budge and said imperiously that there was nothing to be afraid of a couple of monsters, because they also had high-class magicians. The guy, stuttering, objected. After all, there were too many lizards. Sierra took a closer look and realized that this was really true. A whole flock of vortex lizards was now running towards them. Yolman perked up and reacted to this news with undisguised admiration. Anthony screamed, convinced that there were too many reptiles. He cursed the mercenaries, shouting that he called them to kill the unicorn, and not to stir up the lair of the vortex lizards. The fact is that these terrifying monsters were mid-low level magical beasts that moved at incredible speed and sprayed poison with their teeth. The man tried to reassure those present. There is no need to be afraid of these lizards, but now there are really too many of them. Fighting with them will take a lot of energy. You need to come up with a way to have less contact with monsters while the hunt for the unicorn is underway. He waved his hand towards the crew, ordering the squad to take their places to escape the lizards. One of the mercenaries interrupted him, pointing his finger to the side. An incredible scene appeared before the leader of the detachment. Yolman was stroking the animal like an affectionate cat, while the lizard rested its front paws on his chest. Anthony, not believing his own eyes, asked Sierra if her fiancé was familiar with these creatures. She waved her hands, smiling awkwardly. The witch explained that Lou's ability to get along with magical beasts exceeds that of ordinary people. Then the man suggested to the apostle to ask the flock to move aside a little in order to continue their journey. Waving off the annoying licks, Yolman grinned. He had a better idea. The roar on the stones from powerful paws filled the entire space of the mountain. Now the flock of whirlwind lizards are saddled by people, leaving the coachman behind to guard the carriages. Anthony shouted irritably at Yolman that this was a dubious idea. But the apostle joyfully replied that this method of transportation is very fast and convenient. He laughed, holding the lizard's horn with one hand. Sierra, who was watching him, allowed herself to smile. She even liked the student that way. Finally, the strange procession approached the foot of the Laertes volcano. People jumped off their makeshift horses. Anthony pointed to the entrance to the cave. That's where they found the unicorn. It was clear that the stone at the entrance was stained with blood. Suddenly, one of the vortex lizards stuck out its tongue and hissed loudly. Looking in that direction, Yolman immediately became wary. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. It seemed like there really was something inside. The guy released a flock of lizards. They, clinging to the ground, obeyed the order. Sierra was the first to step fearlessly towards the cave. The rest of the travelers followed. The company slowly moved along the stone corridor. A man from the detachment stepped forward, lighting the way with a gas lamp. Anthony looked at Lou's back. He would never have thought that this guy could get along with wild animals so well. He smiled insidiously. Even if they curbed the unicorn, Sierra and her student would not survive today. Finally, the procession approached the through exit to the main part of the cave, where the unicorn lived. Coming out of the corridor, they found themselves on the edge of a cliff. Deadly burning lava bubbled and seethed, trying to splash over the edge. Everyone screamed in unison at what they saw. It seemed as if there was nothing around except a stream of fiery liquid. Suddenly, a bright glow caught everyone's attention. The man exclaimed that he saw a treasure. Not far away, washed by lava on one side, the same stone lay in the rocks. Violet pink in color, it beckoned travelers to it. Yolman tensed. The stone was unusual. It periodically trembled, and these movements seemed familiar to the guy. Anthony muttered happily, stepping forward, that since there was no fire unicorn, it meant there was an opportunity to grab the stone. But he did not notice how the lava began to seethe more strongly, spitting around in bright bubbles. The fire witch cast a wary glance in that direction. Suddenly she rushed towards Anthony, holding out her arms towards him. and ordered him to stop. A huge fireball burst out of the gorge right in front of them. The man raised his head and, with his mouth open, watched his movement. His legs suddenly gave way and he fell to the floor, moving back because a huge clawed paw stepped on the edge of the gorge. A fiery unicorn, completely engulfed in fire, slowly crawled towards the squad, its mouth open. A magical beast of a rare level, it came from the eastern continent, was a master of fire attacks, and also deadly strong. The mercenaries stood in stances, stretching their magic wands forward, ready to rush into the attack at any moment. Sierra, while creating magical runes in front of her, quickly said that this fire unicorn is a rare magical animal. Although its killing power is not as high as that of natural disaster level animals, it will not give up easily. Then the girl ordered the student to wait aside, and if the chance came, he could use his taming talent. The apostle thought that the master was speaking correctly. Unicorns have an obstinate character. If you tame him, the creature can resist, and it is better for him not to show his magic in front of this whole crowd. Yolman spread his hands. Ordinary people will not be able to understand his power. The unicorn slowly advanced on the still-lying Anthony, who, trembling, hysterically ordered his squad to get rid of the beast. The warriors pointed their wands forward, calling out the command Ice Coffin. Blocks of ice rained down on the dragon from all sides. Having surrounded the unicorn, they, led by the owner, tried to block the beast. For a moment it seemed as if the dragon was trapped in the snow. The beast became angry. Its eyes flashed dangerously. Powerful streams of fire gushed out from the beast's body. No matter how strong the mercenary's magic was, it still could not withstand the fiery pressure. There was an explosion. Pieces of ice flew in all directions, and the dragon found himself free. The wounded mercenaries were breathing heavily, bending at the knees. The unicorn, who didn't care, ran forward again, preparing to attack the people. The squad, seeing this, hurried in horror to run away from the monster's sight. At the same moment, the beast's horn collided with the magic sword with a ringing sound. Sierra wasted no time in rushing to attack, and now used her weapon to block his attack. The animal narrowed its eyes dangerously, growling even louder. It moved its head to the side, trying to push the sword away from the horn. Sierra felt in horror how her grip was weakening, and the sword in her hands was moving to the side. The unicorn let out a roar and turned its head sharply, trying to throw off the annoying enemy. There was a powerful explosion from the collision. The fire which was thrown back several meters. The sword remained in her hands. The stone that the people came for shook dangerously from the force of the blow. He was lying right on the edge of the cliff, so a push of such force expectedly provoked the movement of the stone, and it bouncing, almost fell straight into the flow of bubbling lava. Anthony watched in horror as his treasure disappeared in the raging fire. The unicorn turned around and rushed in that direction, but the stone did not have time to land in the lava. Yolman reacted with lightning speed, and in no time he was in the air, holding his prey tightly above his head. The warriors opened their mouths as they watched this. A few moments later, the apostle landed on solid ground. A worried Sierra immediately ran up to him, saying that this stone contained a raging flame, so he needed to be careful. The stone in Yolman's hands became hot. He screamed, and an angry unicorn immediately appeared behind him. Anthony clenched his fists. If this continues, the guy will end up with both the stone and the unicorn. The apostle turned around with a smile, and said that the Jones clan was wrong from the very beginning. This is not a precious stone. Yolman didn't have time to tell the whole story when a portal appeared in the air right behind him. Having sharply increased in size, huge gray tentacles stretched out from it in a stream. The shoots approached Charlotte and Yolman with lightning speed. The guy turned around sharply when he heard an unusual sound. He pushed Charlotte sharply to the side. The girl did not have time to turn around, but her student was already tightly grabbed by the tentacles and pulled into the portal. Time dragged on like an eternity, and now the witch follows the figure disappearing into the dark matter. She leaned forward and screamed as loud as she could. Following Lou, the tentacles tightly grabbed the fiery unicorn. The animal could only growl from powerlessness. Sierra froze in shock at what she saw. She realized that this was the wasteland of Poseidon. Anthony gave the order to his squad to attack the unicorn. Pointing his hand in his direction, the warriors immediately obeyed. The unicorn, which was already being pulled into the portal by the tentacles tightly clinging to its body, now had many ice shards flying towards it. Events developed so rapidly that Sierra could not fully come to her senses. The dragon was covered with snow, dust, and even more fragments. When the icy fog cleared, the beast was free from the hazy bonds, but was now pinned to the stone wall by ice blocks. The fiery witch rushed to Anthony, bombarding him with questions about what was happening, and he, smiling from ear to ear, laughed at the girl's naivety and said that he had no intention of cooperating with her. With resentment in his voice, the man shouted about Charlotte's reluctance to become related to him, although she had promised earlier, and at the Congress she and the boy made him look like a complete idiot and disgraced him in front of the guests. The villain's face twisted in a cruel grin. The Jones clan had already suffered from Murderbell. It was time to pay the bills, and it was not for nothing that he called the Master of the Wasteland to deal with Sierra and her student. Charlotte clenched her teeth in anger at herself. Then she definitely saw Poseidon in the corridor. Holding the sword in front of her, Sierra warned that no one would leave here alive if something happened to her student. At that moment, the portal moved and separated the witch from the others. Poseidon's voice was heard. He heard what the girl was saying. Then the Void Walker himself emerged from the portal, grinning, answering that her student had already become dinner for the Master of the Wasteland. Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief. All the ridiculous, cute and funny moments she lived with Lou flashed through her head. In place of grief came rage. The witch swung her sword and rushed at her opponents, offering to pay them for lunch with their lives. A magical fire whirlwind formed behind her. Poseidon did not move. Putting his hand forward, he directed a portal at the girl, the gates of the wasteland. The whirlwind created by Charlotte for the attack was immediately pulled into the gate. She clenched her teeth, not believing that this was possible. The man reflected her own magic into Sierra. The fiery flashes knocked her off her feet, and the girl lost her balance. However, she landed on one knee, covered in bruises, and was now coughing raggedly. The magician stood there, chuckling, saying that the magic of the wasteland exists outside the basic framework of magic. Even the magic of a fiery sword cannot overcome it. His sharp gaze pricked from under the hood. The man advised not to make unnecessary movements, but simply die. A traitor from the Jones clan sarcastically asked if it was too easy to let him die like that. A trickle of blood flowed from the corner of Sierra's lips as she listened carefully to the men's conversation, thinking about what to do next. Gritting her teeth in pain, the witch analyzed what Poseidon had said. There was only one way left for her to overcome this higher magic. Charlotte ran to the place where the immobilized but still alive unicorn was still hanging. Anthony panicked when he saw where the witch was heading and yelled to stop Sierra before she got to the unicorn's blood. Poseidon calmly replied that she was only wasting her energy. He then laughed knowingly without saying anything. Meanwhile, Charlotte sat on the unicorn's lap. Placing her palms under the wound from which blood flowed, she asked for forgiveness for the fact that she was going to take his powers. The wounded animal growled inwardly, unable to defend itself. The girl took a deep breath and quickly swallowed some blood. Something happened that she never expected. Falling on all fours, the witch began to cough annoyingly. The sensations were comparable to as if her whole body was being consumed by a fierce fire. It became impossible to breathe. The insides seemed to be corroded by heat. Poseidon slowly approached her, saying that Charlotte was too naive to believe the words of old man Aces, because drinking the blood would only burn her alive. Pressing her hand to her throat, the fire witch croaked that the director would not deceive her. The man chuckled, looking her up and down. It looked like the girl didn't know Aces at all. Hazy Dan turned to the squad and said that if they killed the witch now, there could be an explosion of heavenly fire raging in Charlotte. So it is better to leave her here, die a natural death. The stone is still in their hands. The witch understood that she couldn't let them just leave, but how hard every movement was. But suddenly something changed. An unknown force lifted her above the ground. The space around was literally burning with fire. The Thousand Lights Master's natural magic has awakened. The men turned around in shock. This should not have happened. With tears in her eyes, Sierra said that even after awakening her natural magic, she was very sad about the loss of her student, and therefore there is no need to expect mercy. A bright, burning flash hid the girl's figure from view. The magician immediately created a void field spell. But something went wrong. The owner of the void did not answer him. Meanwhile, a fiery dragon with its mouth wide open flew to where the men stood. Anthony stepped back, not understanding what was happening or how the beast appeared. It was as if a pillar of fire had burst from the bowels of the earth, filling the entire space. Then there was a deafening explosion. After a few seconds it became quiet. The dust from the destruction had settled. Sierra's opponents lay on the ground, wearing burnt clothes and with multiple wounds on their bodies. Poseidon, unable to move, could not even think that someone could master the magic of heavenly fire, the fire which softly sank to the ground. She was not at all happy that she was receiving the natural magic she so desired. Suddenly, popping noises were heard in the caves, the sound moving like a moon along the walls. The witch looked sharply towards the entrance. To her surprise, the director of the Aces Academy slowly entered the cave. He stopped with his hands behind his back and asked the girl if she had awakened her natural magic. She nodded, noticing that the director looked strange. Hazydan, still lying on the ground, laughed with difficulty, saying that this old man had been waiting from the very beginning for the day when the witch would awaken natural magic. All this, none other than the kidnapping demon. Charlotte didn't believe what she heard, and stared wide-eyed at the director she knew so well. According to legends, 500 years ago a monster appeared that was capable of stealing natural magic from people, and for 200 years there was no person capable of defeating it. But the chronicles say that after the battle with the seventh apostle Sarlia, the demon disappeared without a trace. According to rumors, he had already died a long time ago. Who then was Director Aces all this time? Always so kind and sincere, the old man suddenly changed his face and turned to Sierra. She said that if she could awaken her natural magic, the girl would help the director with many things, and since this is troublesome, you can come up with another way out. Round glasses sparkled provocatively. The man asked what if he directly took her magic talent. Sierra screamed, not expecting such words from the director. Aces now looked nothing like his former self. He pulled himself up and sharply grabbed his ward by the throat, lifting her into the air. It was a blow below the belt. Charlotte did not have time to react, and now greedily swallowed the air that was barely entering her lungs. And the man spoke such painful words. If he did not feel that she could awaken the master of 1,000 fires, would he have raised her so carefully? He said with a laugh that Charlotte now looks incredibly pathetic. The essence of her existence is to awaken natural magic, and allow Aces to take it away. The man was completely illuminated with light, his eyes wide open, as if with one glance he was drawing all the strength from his former student. The witch did not believe that this was happening in reality. She croaked a quiet teacher, not understanding what hurt more, from his actions or from the lack of oxygen. The fire, and with it the power, slowly flowed from her body to the director. When the exchange was completed, the fire described an arc in the air, and finally left the Sierra. Aces waited a few more moments. A second later, Charlotte was lying face down on the ground, easily creating a small cloud of fire in his palm. Aces exclaimed with pleasure how beautiful natural magic is. Putting his hands behind his back again, he glanced at Sierra and said that there was no point in letting her live now. Poseidon, deciding that it was better not to move, thought with horror that when the old man dealt with the witch, then it would be his turn. But why is the owner of the void still not answering? At that moment, space split in the air above the abyss. Aces cast a wary glance there. Black cracks went straight through the air, growing larger every second. Then a stream of air rushed out from there, almost knocking the demon off his feet. He immediately began creating runes in the air so that he could attack if necessary. At first he could not see anything because of the dense cloud of dust, but soon a piece of a huge tentacle fell out of the crack, and then a male figure appeared. Yolman deftly jumped out of the abyss. Holding a sword in his hand, he stepped on a piece of flesh with force. Aces froze. It couldn't be. Could this guy really be able to deal with the strongest of the world of the void, its owner himself? The apostle, with the toe of his boot, pushed away the tentacle from which blue liquid was dripping, and winced. Why does this octopus have so many tentacles? He just wasted his time. His gaze glared tenaciously at the director, immediately realizing that everything had not gone according to plan. But when the guy saw Sierra lying without signs of life, his eyes darkened. His master, covered in blood, did not move at all. Yolman's voice echoed through the cave as he asked who did this. Aces smiled into his beard and replied that it was he. Then he kicked the girl's body aside. The apostle lowered his head, assessing the teacher's injuries. He immediately asked if the director had taken away her natural magic. He agreed happily and said that the guy should feel proud of his master, because it was she who had a hand in his future victory over the apostle. 300 years ago, in a battle with Sarlia, he realized that ordinary natural magic, no matter how much there was, could not overcome the apostle, and so the demon needed even more power. Crazily darting his eyes somewhere into the distance, The old man continued that for this he needed high-level magic and the energy left by the apostle. Therefore, he spent his strength to train Sierra, and did not reveal his real identity in order to get the energy of the apostle. The man bent down and wiped a tear from the girl's closed eyelids. Then a lamp with a violet light appeared in his hand, and the figure of the demon itself began to glow. Today was the day when he received both the highest level magic, the heavenly flame, and the energy of the apostle, the hellish flame. Aces laughed demonically, because now, possessing many unique abilities, he is again ready to fight with the apostles. But before that, he needs to deal with people, those real scum. The apostle drew attention to the unfortunate unicorn. Then he walked over to Sierra and got down on one knee, checking her pulse. At this time, Aces was already creating a magical fireball, loudly boasting that now heaven and hell were with him, so he no longer needed anyone. The demon threw a wave of fire into the air. Yolman mockingly asked if the old man really hopes for these splashes. Excalibur in his hands glowed bright green. Swinging his sword, the apostle pointed it at the scorching magical waves. A tangible light passed right through them, and the next moment the flames subsided. There were only streams of air left when the guy lowered his hand. Hazy Dan sat down on the ground, muttering that this man was really strong. Could he really be Sierra's disciple? Aces noticed Yolman's unusual abilities and asked who he was, because the guy did not at all look like a person from a famous family, and could even use sylph. He smiled charmingly and asked to guess. A load of rocks fell from the ceiling of the cave. Yolman lost his temper and ran straight towards Aces, shouting as he went that if he guessed right, he would receive a prize. The demon bared his teeth and began to call upon the stolen magic. Spell runes formed at his feet. Yolman was already in the air, and now swung his sword. The apostle swung, creating a magical line of soft green color around himself. He crashed to the ground, as if the space had split into several parts again. An incredible stream of force now emanated from the sword, dangerously lifting large pieces of stones upward. Yolman pointed his sword at Aces. The demon spread his arms, trying to hold back the whirlwind flying towards him. Lightning bolts of high-level magic emanated from the palms. Yolman hissed threateningly, knowing that Aces could hear him. If he doesn't guess correctly, the old man will be punished. The two forces collided with a roar as the apostle ran up to the director. A deafening explosion occurred. Its echoes were of such a scale that they pierced the top of the cave, forming a large hole there. Poseidon raised his eyes worriedly. If they continue in this spirit, the volcano may explode. The magician stood up, staggering, cursing Aces and his opponent. It didn't matter to him who would survive. In any case, they wouldn't let him go alive, so he had to run away from here. The demon coughed from the resulting cloud of dust. Yolman once again demanded that Sierra be given back her natural magic. But Aziz just laughed. The stolen magic of talent cannot be returned back. Blood oozed from the torn clothes. But the demon didn't seem to care. He asked if the guy really thought he could defeat him. The man clenched his palm. The glass lamp in it crunched, releasing a violet flame. Poseidon recoiled in shock. It was the fire of the underworld, belonging to the mythical apostle. What was the old man up to? Aces laughed madly, looking at Yolman. The fire that was dancing on his palms suddenly grew to enormous sizes. Now it was as if the demon was burning within him. He spread his hands, controlling the flame, and said that this was the most powerful force left by the apostle, and that the guy was lucky, because he would be the first to die from such force. The magician directed the flame forward, and it obediently obeyed its owner. Destructive fire swept through the bodies of people lying on the ground. Aces breathlessly admired the apostle's strength. At that moment Sylph appeared. She stood in front of Yolman, and created a storm barrier using her magic. This helped for a short time. Her energy was able to hold back the fire of the underworld. The apostle shouted for the girl to take Sierra, and they left from here. The spirit of the sword, holding the barrier, replied that its main mission was to protect its owner. Suddenly she felt a soft stroking on the top of her head, which had already become familiar. Yolman confidently ordered her not to worry, because this light could not harm him. The girl looked at the apostle with admiration.